Chapter 3677. Mr. Bai walked out. Milan? He paused and said. Shirley went out. Oh. Yi Milan's voice was light. Did she see Lin Cece? Mrs. Bai came back to her senses and took the things in his hands. Did you ask Shirley? I guessed. Yi Milan smiled and took off his coat. Isn't it asleep? Mrs. Bai's expression softened at the mention of her granddaughter. I just coaxed her to sleep. She's such a good girl. Yi Milan's voice became soft. I'll go see her. Then, he went to the guest room quietly and came back after checking on an and Mrs. Bai had already brewed the precious Da Hong Pao tea and put it on the coffee table. Mr. Bai set up the chessboard. Let's play 2 games. I don't know when Shirley will come back. Mrs. Bai agreed. The couple treated Yi Milan like they used to. They treated him as a son-in-law. Yi Milan sat down and played chess with Mr. Bai. A mature man would give in to his elders, especially when he felt guilty towards Mr. Bai. When Mr. Bai was in power, he took good care of the Yi family. Although he had offended some people, he was still an upright man. Yi Milan couldn't change the ending and could only try his best to make it up to him. Fortunately, Mr. Bai was very open-minded now. He would not be too attached to the past. The two of them played chess and drank tea. Mrs. Bai accompanied them for a while and refilled their cups. Then she went to accompany an nun. Before going to bed, she asked Yi Milan to stay the night. Of course Yi Milan agreed. Mr. Bai listened with a gentle look on his face. Mrs. Bai looked down and left. She glanced at Yi Milan's fingers. They were clean, slender, and beautiful. She thought of the bruise on Shirley's chin. It didn't look like it was caused by such beautiful fingers. Yi Milan remembered her look, but he didn't show it on his face, and continued to play chess with Mr. Bai. At 12 o'clock Lin Cece called. She sounded a little breathless. Yi Milan, when you have time, come over and take this night owl home. Her alcohol tolerance is terrible. Lin Cece almost wanted to cry. She didn't know that Bai Shueli was so bad when she was drunk. She looked like she was about to pounce on her. Lin Cece was not a man and couldn't satisfy her. She could only call Yi Milan. Yi Milan listened quietly. After asking for the address, he looked at Mr. White. Shirley is drunk. I'm going to pick her up. Mr. White replied with an O, and started to collect the chess pieces. After thinking for a moment he asked softly, Milan, there is something I want to. When Yuan and I are divorced. Dad, in my heart, Shueli has always been my wife. Also, my mother knows that Xiangnan is Mubai's child. Yi Milan explained respectfully. Mr. White was startled, and then he said in a low voice, Then, you and Shirley shouldn't come back tonight. Find a place to stay for the night. His words were a little vague, but it was actually something like that. Actually, Mr. White was thinking that it hadn't been easy for Yi Milan these few years. As a man he understood. Yi Milan looked down and smiled. Thank you, Dad. I'll bring Shueli back tomorrow night. Mr. White saw him out. Seeing his hurried steps, he smiled slightly. Back then, when he married Shueli to Mu Bai, it was because he could see that Mu Lin liked Shueli. If he didn't do something ruthless, this brat probably wouldn't admit it even after 100 years. He was also very arrogant, but in recent years, he had calmed down a lot. He was a good seedling, and he was also handsome. He was much better than these old things. This book came from Chapter 3678. When Yi Milan drove to the bar, it was already late at night. Lin Cece was guarding a drunkard and looked helpless. When she saw Yi Milan coming over, she finally heaved a sigh of relief. She's finally here. I really can't do anything to her alone. I can't move her, but she refuses to leave. She said she's waiting for a hero to come and pick her up. Lin Cece said helplessly, she thinks she's Xixia Fairy. Then she looked at Yi Milan and smiled happily. You don't look like Joker either. I'm born in the year of the monkey, Yi Milan said calmly. Lin Cece felt that this answer was really harsh. Before Yi Milan bent down to carry Bai Shueli, he looked at the bottles on the table and counted them. There were at least 15 or 16 bottles. He frowned and said she drank all of them. Lin Cece couldn't help but roll her eyes. Big brother, I drank at least 10 bottles. Shueli's alcohol tolerance is too low now. Back then, she still had the nerve to tell me that she was some kind of nightclub princess. I think she's more like a nightclub sow. Yi Mulin carried by Shueli and walked towards the door. He said in a low voice, "Let's go. I'll send you back." Lin Cece followed behind and shouted, "Then you'll pay the bill. We drank the best tonight. It'll cost at least 100,000. Shueli and I are poor now." Yi Mulin turned to look at her. Lin Cece squeezed out a smile. Walking to the bar, he held the woman in his arms with one hand and swiped his card. Then he looked at Lin Cece and said disapprovingly, "Don't drink so much with her in the future. Men don't like drunkards." Guze was one of those men. Lin Cece stuck out her tongue behind his back and followed him into the car. It was very late at night. She didn't want to take a taxi back. It was a little dangerous. Moreover, it would be a waste not to use Shueli's man. He didn't care what kind of leader he was. He was Shueli's man. Lin Cece sat in the back seat of the car with a clear conscience until he sent her to the apartment. She thought that was it, but when she opened the car door, Yi Mulin said, "You and Guze are still the same." The reason he asked this was because she was still living here. If she was with Guze, she could have a better material life. He was also a little puzzled. All these years, Guze and Lin Cece clearly hadn't completely separated, and sometimes they would even sleep together. Why didn't they take things a step further? After Yi Mulin asked, Lin Cece was a little surprised. She was stunned for a while and then asked, "Did you change your household registration?" Yi Mulin sat in the car and looked at a sports car in front of him. He smiled silently. "I'm just concerned. Shirley said that Frivolous is her best sugar daddy." Lin Cece snorted. "At least she has a conscience." She opened the car door and got out. She paused for a moment. "Yi Mulin, don't make her sad anymore. Don't make her worry, or be in a difficult position. Women don't have many years of youth left, and she has given all of them to you. Even after so many things have happened, she still loves you." When she spoke, her voice was especially gentle, and her gaze was also very gentle as she looked at Bai Shueli. Yi Mulin smiled. "I know." When he saw the car lights in front of him turn on, he smiled again and drove away with a bad intention, leaving Lin Cece standing there alone. Lin Cece was dazzled by the car lights and reached out to block them. At this moment, the lights went off and a person walked out of the car. It wasn't anyone else, but Guze, who had disappeared for about a month. They had been living like this for the past few years. He would occasionally come over, maybe for a night or a week. If he wanted to come, he would come whenever he wanted. Even when he came, she didn't chase him away. If he wanted to have sex with her, she would just treat it as a way to comfort her and her husband. Anyway, she had her physical needs. Besides, he was handsome, skilled, and had money. Sometimes, he would come over and give her money, ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Sometimes he would also bring her gifts, bags, clothes, and whatnot. They were all quite expensive. Anyway, with her current ability, she couldn't afford them, so she accepted them and treated them as his rent. At this moment, he suddenly came over and saw Yi Mulin's car. Lin Cece suddenly understood. She seemed to have been framed by Yi Mulin. He had purposely said those words to make it seem like she didn't get out of the car. Guze must have thought that her wild man had sent her back. She broke Yi Mulin into a few pieces in her heart. Chapter 3679. Lin Cece sighed in her heart before walking over to Guze. She stood still and placed her hands behind her back. "You're back." Guze had slammed the car door with a lot of force just now. With a loud bang, he seemed to be really angry. Lin Cece's attitude was as though she could run away at any moment if the situation was not right. Guze looked at her coldly under the streetlights. "Whose car did you sit in?" Lin Cece chuckled and flicked her hair. "Are you jealous?" Guze grabbed her wrist instantly and said in a displeased tone, "Lin Cece." She tilted her head and looked at him. "Oh, who are you to me? Why are you controlling me like this?" With that said, she broke free from him and walked towards her apartment. She walked in the dark and said those words angrily. However, there was a faint smile on her lips. Guze stood there and looked at the direction in which she had left. Then he kicked the car door harshly. The car door that was worth more than 10 million instantly deformed a little. Well, there was no one else. Lin Cece stopped in her tracks and turned around to look at him. Are you angry? With his hand on the car door, he looked up at her, and his eyes were a little red. Lin Cece stood in the dark and smiled quietly. Guze, I'm not wrong. We sleep together occasionally, but neither of us have promised each other. Even if you come over tonight and tell me that you're getting married tomorrow, I won't quarrel with you. We're just pals. Why do you have to take it so seriously? He looked at her for a long time and suddenly walked over. His voice was hoarse. Lin Cece, just how heartless are you? After so many years of companionship, you actually say that we're pals? He was practically growling out. Lin Cece, you drank in the middle of the night and were sent home by a wild man. Yet, you're saying such things to me. He grabbed her body and pressed her against the car door. He wanted to be rough with her, but did not dare to do anything to her. He could only get angry at himself. How far have you gotten with him? I haven't satisfied you yet, and you still want to find another man. Lin Cece was very brave. He's the one who came to find me. Guze lowered his head and inched closer to her face. His breath was hot and scalding. At this moment, he was like a fire dragon that wanted to melt her. Have you slept with him? Actually, he didn't think so, because that man had already left. If such an opportunity had passed, he wouldn't have left. Look at how alluring the little woman in his arms was right now. Her face was red from drinking, and the rest of her body was very white. She was so small in his arms. Lin Cece wanted to move away, but every time she moved, he would move to the other side and grab her to prevent her from escaping. Not only was she unable to escape, but she was also panting after a while. He seemed to be very concerned, his voice low and hoarse. Tell me, and I'll let you go. Lin Cece turned her face to the side. Her chest was pressed against his as she breathed heavily. In such a cold night, two young bodies pressed against each other, and in a short while the smell changed. He hadn't appeared for a month, and she didn't know where he went. As soon as he came back, he looked as if he was catching her in the act of adultery. What right did he have? Lin Cece bit her lips and turned her head. Her two slender arms wrapped around his neck, and she raised her head to look into his eyes seductively. Let me go. Do you mean that you won't sleep with me tonight if you don't make love to me? Her words were simply deliberate. Guze's Adam's apple couldn't help but roll a few times when he thought of the specific scene. This book came from Chapter 3680. After a long while he said, Tell me first, what's your relationship with him, huh? Lin Cece sneaked out from under his arm. By Shueli's man, is it clear enough? Is it clear enough? Guze narrowed his eyes, grabbed her hand, and pressed her against the car. He leaned over and kissed her fiercely. When she moved, he raised her hand above her head and pressed it against the roof of the car. His actions were simply rough. Lin Cece was in pain and said softly, My arm is about to break. Her voice was hoarse, as if she was complaining and acting coquettishly. Guze was still kissing her hungrily, as if he wanted to eat her up. He paused and said, Bear with it. She felt wronged and turned her face away from him. But he always found a way to kiss her, and he loved to kiss her from her cheeks to her chin. Lin Cece avoided him, and when he kissed her like this, she almost cried. Her tears wet her face, and Guze also tasted the salty taste. He pressed his lips against hers and asked softly, Don't you like me kissing you? You weren't like this before. He thought about it, and felt uneasy again. You've had another man this month, huh? She shook her head and cried out in pain. Only then did he realize that he was holding her hand at an inhumane angle, and he immediately felt a little guilty. He let go of her and rubbed her hand, saying, Why didn't you say so earlier? She bit her lips. I told you earlier, but you ignored me again. He rubbed her hand for a while and let go. Let's go up. Lin Cece paused and said, Guze, I have something to say to you. I have something to say to you too. He looked at her. Let's talk upstairs. She thought about it and didn't object. They went to her apartment. It wasn't very new, but it was warm and small. As soon as they entered the door, he pressed her against the door and kissed her passionately. Lin Cece was softened by him soon. It had been a month, and she missed it too. He had done it once behind the door. Then he had carried her into the bedroom and cleaned the gun on her bed twice more. He had done it so many times that he had spent the better part of the night. Guze's energy, which he hadn't vented for a month, was almost exhausted. He lay on the bed and smoked, with the petite woman in his arms. In the dim light he suddenly said, "Lin Cece, let's get married." The body in his arms stiffened, and then she said softly in the darkness, "Guze, what I want to tell you is that I want to go to City A, to go to my parents' side. They need my care." Guze pressed down the cigarette butt. "This doesn't conflict with our marriage. I can bring your parents to be City to take care of them. Cece, after so many years we should have a result." Lin Cece looked at him and said in a low voice after a long time, "If I go to City A, you can also go to find me." Guze's eyes were a little unhappy. He stared at her eyes and said, "Do you think that I'm with you just to sleep with you and be satisfied as soon as I put on my pants at dawn?" She didn't say anything, but propped herself up and leaned against the headboard of the bed. She also took a cigarette and lit it. After taking a puff, she looked at him faintly. "Guze, I didn't mean that, but I've never thought about getting married. You can think about it now." His voice was heavy. This book comes from Chapter 3681. Lin Cece looked at him and smiled after a while. "I have to do as you say, right? That's why I don't want marriage, because I don't want to entrust myself to a man. If I lose him, I'll lose everything, and I won't be able to take it." She looked down. "Isn't it good for us to be like this?" He glared at her. "Is that so? Do you really think it's good?" Lin Cece smiled. "What else? What good is there in being your Mrs. Gu? Other than having endless money, I'm just an unhappy bird. I don't want to be like that anymore." Guze's eyes and breathing were painful. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. "Lin Cece, do you want me to beg you?" She put out the cigarette and shook her head. "No, really, Guze. I don't want you to beg me. I just don't want to get married." He was silent. She continued, "If you feel that you can't accept this, we can end it. Actually, we didn't promise anything. It's fine as long as you don't come." Guze suddenly smiled. "Lin Cece, I'm just a friend to you, right? It doesn't matter who I am. The main thing is that I'm safe, healthy, and skilled, so you chose me, right?" There was a touch of sadness in his eyes. "It's been a few years. I thought you had accepted me and were ready. I was gone for a month. I chose a diamond ring with my own hands. I thought you would like it, but you preferred freedom." Angered, he got up and put on his pants. After pulling it up, he took out a box from his pocket and threw it to her. "If you don't like it, throw it away. I may not need it in the future anyway." Listen to what he has heard tonight. What does he mean by coming and going as he pleases? For the past few years, he had given all his spare time to a woman. She didn't feel anything at all. He cooked for her, stayed up late with her, and even ran the bathwater for her. He had done everything a man could do. It had been a few years, not a few days. She said she didn't want him, and that meant she didn't want him anymore. She treated him like a dispensable object. "I'm not going to serve you anymore." After Guze put on his pants, his eyes were a little hot, and he felt a little wronged. Criminals still had their sentences. She had sentenced him to death. Before he died, she had enjoyed his flesh to her heart's content. After enjoying it, she had kicked him away. It was really good. Although Guze was particularly angry, he was very slow in putting on his shirt. Lin Cece, who was lying on the bed, looked at his back. Even his back was angry. He must be furious. Indeed, for the past few years, they had been living like a married couple. Zhou Zong would be together for 3 to 4 days a week, and when he came back from a business trip, he would directly bring his luggage to her place to spend the night. He was probably angry, because he felt that she had a heart of stone, and had ruined his good intentions. She opened the box and froze. It was a top-notch fiery red blood diamond, dazzling. Lin Cece watched for a while, then asked Guze softly, "Did you do it yourself?" Guze snorted coldly, "Of course. Which man do you think would spend so much effort on a woman in her early 30s? Lin Cece took out the ring and tried it on her finger. It was just right. She looked at the fire color and snorted, "Yes, she's in her 30s. Mr. Gu, you have to endure such an old woman." Guze was angry. He turned his head and said, "Lin Cece, don't go too far." Book from Chapter 3682. Lin Cece smiled. "How am I going too far? You gave it to me. I can't wear it until I marry you, or throw it away." As she spoke, she plucked it out and threw it towards the window. Guze's eyes were bloodshot. He stared at the window for a while before turning back to glare at Lin Cece. "You woman! How hateful!" As he spoke, he picked up his coat with one hand and was about to walk out. Damn it, he didn't want to take this anymore. However, he had only taken a few steps when a soft body pressed against him from behind. Her slender arms were wrapped around his waist, and her face was pressed against his back. Then an ice-cold object appeared in his hand. He looked down and saw that it was the fire diamond. For a moment, Guze's mood was very complicated. He coughed lightly and asked, "What do you mean?" Lin Cece pressed her face against his back and said softly, "I've thought about it carefully. Girls can't get married casually. Do you think I'll marry you just because you threw the ring to me? I'm not a big yellow dog by the roadside." Guze held the ring and said in a hoarse voice, "Then you want to propose?" Lin Cece walked over to him. She was only wearing a silk nightgown, and there was nothing underneath. To be honest, he didn't want to propose at all. He wanted to carry her to bed, but experience told him not to be too impulsive. Sometimes the sexier a woman was, the more emotional she was. He held the ring and looked at her. "Will you agree if I propose?" Lin Cece pursed her lips. "You can try." Guze stared at her little face. She smiled faintly and extended her hand to him. That hand was incomplete. It was missing a little finger. She said in a low voice, "Guze, wear it on your middle finger." Guze looked at the back of her hand quietly. Instead of putting the ring on her finger, he lowered his head and kissed her fingertips. His voice was low and hoarse. "Lin Cece, I love you." After saying that, he slid the ring into her middle finger bit by bit. When the size was perfect, both of them cried, but with some restraint. "Lin Cece, the previous rejection was just words of anger, wasn't it?" He kissed her fingers, looked at the dazzling light and said in a low voice, "Please let me take care of you in the future." Lin Cece lowered her head. "Guze, I didn't say those words out of anger." He was a little infuriated. She smiled. "Because you took out such a big diamond ring. You're very sincere. I don't think I'll be able to find a man richer than you in the future. So after weighing the pros and cons, I reluctantly agreed." He glared at her, dissatisfied and angry. Lin Cece chuckled and said softly, "Mr. Gu, I'm willing. Do you feel better now?" He was still looking at her, silent, as though he were still angry. She stretched out a slender white finger and gently poked his heart. "So stingy? If you don't like it, we won't get married. I don't want you to look so bitter when we get married." "Who said I'm forcing it?" He pulled her over and pressed her into his arms. His voice was low and hoarse. "Lin Cece, have you thought it through?" She nodded blankly. "I've thought it through. What about you? Let me tell you, I won't sign any prenuptial agreement. What's yours is mine. You have to share everything with me." Guze's hand was on her waist. His voice was hoarse and hoarse. "I couldn't ask for more." Book from Chapter 3683. Lin Cece, let's get married, okay? 5 Guze chuckled. "Let's share my body too, okay?" Lin Cece was a bit sentimental, but she couldn't stand him anymore. She glared at him. "Guze, can you be more serious?" "I'm not serious, Mrs. Gu." He picked her up and pressed her down on the bed again. "Lin Cece, this is the second time you've been Mrs. Gu." She raised her head and looked at him coquettishly. She reached out and gently pulled his tie. "So," his fingers gently caressed her red lips, and his voice was low and husky. "So can I call you second madam from now on?" She was furious. "Guze, you're the one who's a fool. Your whole family is a fool." But she also scolded herself. After scolding her, he looked at her with sparkling eyes. Lin Cece could not take it anymore. She turned her face to the side and said in a hoarse voice, "Will your parents agree to our marriage?" She pressed her face against his chest. "Guze, I'm scared. After so many years, I'm still scared. I'm scared that we won't be accepted. I'm scared that I won't be able to have children anymore." He knew how scared she was, so he gave her all these years until he couldn't take it anymore. He pressed her head gently and kissed her. "I'm scared that I won't be able to have children no matter how old I get." He paused for a moment before saying, "Cece, If we can't get pregnant, we won't adopt, okay? I want to give the rest of my life to you." With that, he kissed her lips and said, "Do you know that I haven't had enough to eat all these years? I'm scared that you'll be too tired. I'm scared that you'll find me annoying and demanding. I'm scared that you'll be in a bad mood. So I don't even dare to change. Mrs. Gu, I want to make it up to you tonight." He said it so confidently. Lin Cece bit her lips. "Guze, we haven't registered our marriage yet. Then let's stamp it first. Make it deeper. Huh?" He shamelessly said as he covered her body with green and purple bruises. If he was a little more rough, it would be enough to cause a family of violence. In the middle of the night, after taking a bath, Lin Cece looked at her neck in the mirror and punched the man who was laughing beside her. "Are you a vampire?" Guze was shaving his beard with a towel wrapped around his waist. He seemed to be in a good mood. He glanced at Lin Cece in the mirror and said slowly, "You were the one who sucked my—" The latter two words were covered by her small hand. She glared at him, forbidding him to continue. Guze pulled down her hand and kissed it. "I'm shaving. Stop it." Lin Cece continued to look at her neck. Guze said while shaving, "Cece, go cook a bowl of noodles for me. I haven't had dinner yet. I'm starving." Lin Cece glared at him. He put down the razor. "Having a good body is a necessary condition to satisfy Madam. Feeding me is also Madam's obligation. Don't you think so, Mrs. Gu?" Lin Cece tightened her bathrobe and snorted. "I'm also very tired now." Guze kissed her. "I'll give you a massage later." "Forget it." She rolled her eyes at him and went to cook for him. After a few steps, she muttered, "I'd rather call you second Madam. I don't have to do anything." Guze laughed. "Look at how much effort I've put into making you feel so comfortable tonight. You just want to cook a bowl of noodles and die. Lin Cece, you heartless little thing." End of this chapter. Chapter 3684. Lin Cece, can we get married? 6-inch, I'm in my early 30s, Mr. Gu. She waved at him. "Let me remind you, you're going to be 40 soon, Mr. Gu." He picked up the razor again and looked at Lin Cece. "Yeah, you're still such a fierce man at 40, Lin Cece. It's not easy for a woman over 30 to find a man." Lin Cece took off her slippers and threw them at him. "Damn it." Guze smiled, picked up the slippers, and walked over to help her put them on. "You still haven't extinguished such a big fire after a month? I'll feed you some after you're done." She blushed and glared at him. Guze smiled. "Good girl, go downstairs." He went back to shave. Well, a man in his 40s also had to pay attention to his appearance. He had to make his wife feel proud all the time. It was hard to be a man these days. Not only did he have to be able to make money, but he also had to be handsome and have all kinds of skills to serve his wife well. But it wasn't bad this way. Lin Cece went downstairs for him in the kitchen. She only had a white bathrobe on, and her long hair was tied into a ponytail. She was naturally slender, so she looked like she was in her early 20s from the back. After Guze walked out, he looked at her and thought about the days when she waited for him in Sea City. He was a jerk back then, but he would make it up to her in the future and spend a lot of time with her. His heart softened, and he walked over to hug her waist from behind. "Cece, is the noodles ready?" "They're almost ready. Sit down and wait." She felt a little uncomfortable being hugged by him. Guze chuckled. He didn't let go of her. Instead, he hugged her tighter. "I missed you." His thin lips were still against her ear. "It's been so long. Don't you miss me, huh?" "No," she said stubbornly. Then she pulled the hand on her waist. "You're so clingy at your age. Guze, aren't you ashamed?" He chuckled and rested his face on her shoulder shamelessly, watching her put the mask back on. Lin Cece couldn't do anything to him. The two of them went to the dining table like conjoined twins. Guze finally ate his noodles in peace and looked up at her. "You're not eating?" she said. "I drank a bit, so I don't have an appetite." Actually, if it wasn't for the alcohol, she wouldn't have been so promiscuous with him. Guze looked at her and said calmly, "Don't drink in the future." "Why?" "Family rules." "Second Madam." Guze drank the last mouthful of noodle soup with satisfaction and looked at her. "Is there more?" Lin Cece was so angry that she wanted to smash the bowl on his head. "No more." "Really?" He smiled and took the bowl to the kitchen. He poured a small portion and ate it in front of her. He wiped his mouth and said, "Second, madam, it tastes good." Lin Cece glared at him. "If you call me that again, I'll give the ring back to you." Guze said, "That's good. I'm comfortable tonight anyway. Give me the ring, and I'll find another woman." As he spoke, he stretched out his hand to take it. Lin Cece was furious. "Guze, you bastard." He grabbed her hand and kissed it. Then he said in a hoarse voice, "Lin Cece, I'll take you somewhere." She was a little confused. It was already late at night. Guze carried her back to the bedroom, helped her put on her coat, changed his clothes, and went out with the car key. End of this chapter. Chapter 3685. Lin Cece, can we get married? 7. After driving for about half an hour, Guze drove into a villa area. It was a very luxurious and high-end villa. As he drove, he explained, "It's developed by my company. I've reserved a piece of land for myself and built a villa there." Lin Cece looked at him. "For me? That's where we'll live after we get married." He smiled and held her hand. In the car, there was music that they both liked. After so many years, they knew each other's preferences very well. In the music, Lin Cece felt a little at ease. She wanted to sleep, but she held on. The car slowly came to a stop at the entrance of a manor. The car did not enter right away. Guze opened the car door and got out, holding her hand as they stood in front of the black door. Lin Cece looked up. The entire manor was about the size of a small district. It looked spectacular, and there was even a Ferris wheel inside. Colorful neon lights flashed around it as it rotated gently in the dark night. Guze looked at Lin Cece and said softly, "If we had a child in the past, she would be the princess here. If not, then Mrs. Gu will have it easy on you. You'll be my princess." As he said that, he pulled her in. They passed through the musical fountain, the merry-go-round, all the way to the gigantic and beautiful Ferris wheel. He knelt down on one knee, a rose in his hand. "Lin Cece, I've waited for a long time. I've confirmed that you're the one who will sleep with me for the rest of my life and feed me from below." Lin Cece looked at him. "Do you have to do this? You clearly want me in your heart, but you have to pretend that you don't care." She lowered her head and took the rose from his hand before hugging him gently. "Guze, I'm willing." He looked up. Under her gentle gaze, all the hurt that they had caused each other all those years disappeared. She smiled gently. "Actually, sometimes I wonder what you're waiting for. Turns out that you can't let it go even more than I can." Guze was still half kneeling, his face buried in her waist. He sighed. "If I had known, I would have proposed in advance to satisfy Mrs. Gu." Lin Cece smiled and reached out to hug his head. Behind her, someone set off fireworks. On such a dazzling night, it belonged to Lin Cece and Guze. Lin Cece nestled in Guze's arms and watched him set off the fireworks for her. She suddenly had the urge to call Bai Shueli. She wanted to tell her that she was getting married. Bai Shueli's phone was turned off. Lin Cece was a little disappointed. Then she sighed softly. Shirley is probably going to be miserable tonight. Thinking about how Guze had been starving for a month, the man from Bai Shueli's family had been starving for so long. It would be strange if he didn't tear Bai Shueli apart tonight. Lin shuddered at the thought of it. On the other side, Yi Mulan brought Bai Shueli to the GM hotel. Once they reached the hotel, she slept like a dead pig for 2 hours. When she woke up, she was still drunk and looked around in a daze. She was drunk. Where was this place? Who was she? Would a naked man come out and tell her that they had slept together? Shen Ying covered her face with her hands and groaned. Yi Mulan brought a cup of hangover soup from the kitchen and saw a certain woman rolling around on the bed with a pained expression. He sneered. She must be dreaming. She probably thought that she had a romantic encounter. End of this chapter. Chapter 3686. Yi Mulan walked over and stood by the side, watching her quietly. The drunk Bai Shueli rolled to the side and stared at him with her dark eyes. Her face was charming because she was drunk. She hugged the pillow and looked at him. After a long while, she asked softly, "Yi Mulan." He sat by the side and reached out to caress her face. "What else?" She was still looking at him. After a long while she said softly, "You're definitely not a pervert. If you were, you would have pounced on me long ago." She gestured at her clothes. "It's torn from here." She giggled and hugged the pillow. "Don't be fooled by his serious appearance. He's actually a very ordinary man. He's very bad." She pointed at her chin. "Look at how he pinched me here. My mom thought that he did it on purpose, because I was serving Yi Mulin. I guess that's what he thinks." "You're right. That's what I think." Yi Mulin was annoyed and amused at the same time. He reached out and pinched her chin gently. He didn't mean it when he accidentally pinched her. But if she thought that was what he meant, he wouldn't be a man if he didn't enjoy it. He moved closer to her, his face almost touching hers. Bai Shueli was so scared that she peed her pants. She stared at him and said in a trembling voice, "Yi Mulin, don't come over." She sobered up. Her eyes widened as she looked at the man, who kept moving closer to her. She wanted to cry but had no tears. "Why don't you come over? Are you like this for other men to enjoy?" Immerse. He held her head and didn't rush to do anything to her. Instead, he caressed her red lips and murmured, "Shueli, do you remember the past?" He caressed her slowly and she said quickly, "I don't remember." He smiled. "If you don't remember, I'll help you remember, MMH." With that said, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. The temperature in the hotel room was of course moderate. Even if their clothes fell to the ground one by one, they wouldn't feel cold. She probably knew his motive, so she was very resistant and kept resisting. When he wasn't paying attention, she jumped down and walked into the bathroom. Yi Mulin smiled and followed her. He pulled the bathroom door shut with a bang. The woman who had escaped was curled up in a corner of the bathroom. She hugged her arms and bit her lip. "Yi Mulin, you're up to no good. You came here to possess me and sleep with me. What's wrong with sleeping with the woman you like? Is sleeping with someone else the right thing to do?" He walked towards her. Bai Shueli screamed, "Don't come over." She didn't want to do that. It was shameful to be looked at like that. In the end, he still walked in front of her and reached out to gently pinch her cheeks. In a low voice he murmured, "Don't you like it? If you don't like it, then next time." She was a little stunned, and then she was hugged by him. He pressed against her and kissed the wall, as though he had been holding it in for a long time. Bai Shueli used her remaining willpower to place it on his shoulder and murmured, "Yi Mulin, have you really never had anyone else?" He was a little annoyed that she still had the heart to ask such a question at this time. He snorted, "Yes, so it's very clean. There's no one else but you." As soon as she finished speaking, Bai Shueli licked her lower lip and swallowed her saliva. She said softly, "Actually, it's not impossible." Chapter 3687. "I've always belonged to you too." His eyes gazed deeply at her, and he kept looking at her. After a long time he said hoarsely, "Bai Shueli, are you really willing?" He hadn't even started, but his mind was already crazily imagining it. His slender fingers caressed her face, caressing that velvety texture, and his dark eyes seemed to be on fire as he looked at her. She let him caress her and moved her face closer to his, like an obedient kitten. Yi Mulin lowered his head and kissed her passionately. After a long time he murmured, "Bai Shueli, I suddenly can't bear to do this to you." His fingers were still on her lips, rubbing and kissing. It was as though he couldn't get enough. The shower in the bathroom had been turned on, and the warm water splashed on her body. It was hot, mixed with the smell of alcohol. Her clothes fell to the ground piece by piece. 10 minutes later, Bai Shueli's voice was a little muffled, and she screamed, "Yi Mulin, you said you can't bear to do this to me." She couldn't finish her sentence. Yi Mulin enjoyed it to his heart's content. His fingers pressed on her scalp and he sighed. "I changed my mind." After that, she didn't have a chance to speak. She didn't know how to speak, and it hurt him a lot. Then there was another kind of mess. After the mess in the bathroom, he carried her to the soft bed in the bedroom. While she was in a good state, he whipped her for the rest of the night. He didn't release her until the sky was just beginning to brighten. Bai Shueli was in a deep sleep. She was exhausted. She lay in his arms, motionless. Yi Mulin lowered his head and looked at the woman in his arms. He felt his life being filled. He stood at such a high place. He had always wanted her to see him, and she was finally back. He smiled and reached out to stroke her hair. He kissed it and said in a hoarse voice, "By Shueli, I still treat you the same way. If you dare to run away from me again, I'll break your legs." Naturally, she couldn't hear him. His voice was deep. "Break your legs, and you'll be chained to the bed from now on. You're not allowed to go anywhere." After saying that, he hugged her again. His face was filled with grievance. "By Shueli, I've liked you for so many years. Sometimes I feel like I've fed a dog." This dog was called By Shueli. His heart was eaten by a dog. Hugging her, he slowly drifted off to sleep. When she woke up, it was already 4 in the afternoon. As soon as Bai Shueli opened her eyes, she stared at the enlarged Jun Yin in front of her. Yi Mulan's voice was indifferent. "Why? Are you disappointed to see me? Did you think that you messed around with a little fresh meat after drinking?" Bai Shueli glared at him, but her face was slightly red. She reached out and pulled the quilt to take a look. Then, she raised her fist and threw it at him. "Yi Mulan, you're too hateful." Her body was covered in hickeys. There wasn't a single spot that was unscathed. He was too despicable. Yi Mulan just let her hit him. She couldn't hurt him anyway. When she was done, he reached out and pulled her into his arms, letting her lie on top of him. Bai Shueli was a mature woman. Naturally, she could feel his strangeness. Her watery eyes widened as she stared at him. "Yi Mulan, you are not human." After torturing her for the entire night, he still had the heart to do it. End of the chapter. Chapter 3688. I have always belonged to you. Yi Mulan looked at her expression and smiled. He reached out to grab her little hand. "Bai Shueli, I'm not 40 yet. Isn't that normal?" Her hand struggled, but he still stuck it to her. Then he whispered, "You're already in your early 30s, but you're still like a little girl. Don't you understand men?" Bai Shueli's face was about to burst into smoke. She bit her lip and glared at him. Yes, she had had a man before, but he was the only one. Although she hadn't compared herself, she knew that ordinary men wouldn't be so powerful. Did he take a jar of aphrodisiac? She stared at him, her eyes full of tears. Yi Mulan chuckled again and reached out to rub her hair. "What's wrong?" She was still staring at him. "Yi Mulan, can't you control yourself?" He looked at her in surprise. "If I could control myself, men wouldn't need women." She gave him a light slap on his face. Only Bai Shueli would dare to slap the bureau chief so openly like this. She glared at him. "Yi Mulan, you're too despicable. Is a woman only good for warming the bed?" He looked at her and chuckled. "But Bai Shueli, this seems to be your biggest role for me. Otherwise, what else? Tell me." He looked like he was accepting it humbly. Bai Shueli was furious. She glared at him and said, "I can still have children." "By Anan?" His hand rested on her back, moving from top to bottom in a hair-raising manner, stroking down bit by bit. Finally, it landed on the place where she was often beaten and pressed down hard. She immediately cried out, "Yi Mulan, what are you doing?" He murmured, "I'm just reminding you that Anan is also half of my effort." She was angry and glared at him. "You only provided semen." As she said that, her eyes became a little red. He could see her sadness, so he reached out and gently stroked her face. His voice was hoarse. "Shueli, it's been hard all these years, hasn't it?" She slapped his hand away and threw a tantrum. "No more." He smiled and looked at her little face. "You're angry that I only care about my own desires, aren't you? Do you think that I have less feelings for you than I do for you?" She made no sound. Any other woman would think the same way, if he were to act like this. Yi Mulan smiled faintly and did not explain. He hugged her and whispered into her ear, "Shueli, I just miss you. It's been so many years and our child has grown up. Don't you miss me at all? Don't you miss the nights we share when you sleep alone?" She lowered her eyes and did not make a sound. He sighed softly and smiled faintly. He didn't say anything and just gently placed her in his arms. After hugging her for a while, he murmured, "I'll take you to wash." As he spoke, he carried her to the bathroom and did not take advantage of her at all. Just as he was about to carry her out of the bathtub, she reached out and hugged him. "Yi Mulan." He lowered his head and looked at her. "What's wrong?" She bit her lips and said softly, "I don't want to be your Qing all the time. Although Anan likes you, others will know her sooner or later." I didn't deliberately hide her existence. She went to my place, didn't she? He reached out and gently pinched her soft face. Baishuali was stunned for a moment. After a long time, she hesitated and said, "You, what do you mean?" End of this chapter. Chapter 3689. I have always belonged to you. He smiled, and didn't answer her question directly. Instead he murmured, "What do you think?" With that he kissed her and carried her back. She was only wearing a bathrobe, while he had changed his clothes neatly. "I'll order a customer service meal for you." He looked at his watch. "I have a meeting later." Baishuali was stunned. "You're leaving soon?" He smiled bitterly. "I'm really busy." Baishuali wanted to throw a tantrum. He had tormented her for so long, and then left her in the hotel while he went to the meeting. But she wanted to throw a tantrum when she suddenly recalled what they had said before. She had asked him, "Yi Mulan, are you happy now that you're standing at such a high position?" He hadn't answered her. And now she wanted to ask him again. She grabbed his arm. He turned to look at her. Baishuali said in a low voice, "Yi Mulan, are you happy? Now standing at such a high position, any normal man would be happy, right?" He turned back, his gaze unfathomable. After a while, he smiled and pinched her face. "Wait for me to come back." But she didn't want to let him go. She still hugged him and asked softly, "Are you happy? This question is very important to me." Yi Mulan thought for a moment and carried her up, pressing her forehead against his. Then he said softly, "Shueli, I'm very happy that you're back. As for work, it's definitely not as interesting as when I was a lawyer, but we have to find a balance. When you want to get what you want the most, you have to put down other hobbies and even sacrifice them, right?" Her throat seemed to be blocked, and she couldn't say anything for a long time. After a long time she murmured, "I'm the most important one, right?" He sighed. "Silly girl. Of course." But he didn't say it out loud. Our chief Yi was also a very proud man. He waited for her to speak first. He kissed her, his voice trembling with unprecedented sexiness. "I really have to go, otherwise everyone in the meeting room will laugh at me and say that I'm stuck in a woman's nest and can't get out." She punched him, and then felt her heart ache. "You haven't eaten anything for a day. Secretary Li will prepare a nutritious meal for me. It's very refreshing," he said in a low, hoarse voice. Baishueli originally hated him very much, but at this moment, she was a little reluctant to let him leave. Her fingers gently stroked his buttons and she murmured, "Yi Mulan, it must be terrible. Make it up to me tonight." He kissed her and thought of something. "Wait for me here. I'll finish at 8. Come here and I'll take you out for a barbecue. Do you want it? Don't get diarrhea again." She laughed at him before her expression turned serious. "Can we go out to eat together? Aren't you afraid of being seen?" He ruffled her hair, smiled, and left without saying a word. After he left, Baishuali thought about it and still felt sorry for him. He seemed to be doing everything for her, and she had been throwing a tantrum. Although he could be very hateful at times, like last night, she did enjoy it. It tasted pretty good. She gently licked her lips, her face a little red. On the other side, Yi Mulan went directly to the general office for a meeting. There were subordinates and people of the same rank in the meeting. After he sat down, Secretary Li reminded him in a low voice, "Chief Yi, your neck has been scratched." End of this chapter. Chapter 3690. Sigh. He came in the afternoon with such a body full of scars, there was no one else. Which leader didn't keep a low profile? Unlike their night chief, who was afraid that others didn't know he had a woman. His real wife was in the hospital. It must be a woman outside to be able to fight like this. Secretary Li's gaze was complicated, and so were the others in the meeting. Those pairs of eyes didn't dare to fall on Night Chief's face. They felt warm just by looking at him. Yi Mulan didn't say anything, and just calmly adjusted the collar of his shirt. That action made the hearts of all the women in the room flutter. How charming. Yi Mulan continued to host the meeting until 7 p.m. In his office, Secretary Li helped him tidy up the documents. Yi Mulan sat in front of the desk, opened the drawer, and took out 2 pills. Secretary Li looked back and frowned, walking over. "Chief, is your stomach uncomfortable again?" "That wasn't right. The chief didn't show any discomfort in the meeting room. But Secretary Lee remembered that the chief didn't want others to know. After all, there were so many scratches on his neck, and now his stomach was acting up, he would be laughed at. Secretary Lee thought of this, and found it both funny and angry. She had followed Yi Mulin for more than 10 years, and felt that he was getting older and older. But he seemed to be getting more and more childish. She went forward and said with concern, "Then you can rest here for a while. I'll stay here and order a light food. You can leave when you feel better." She was really worried. Yi Mulin looked up at her, then said lightly, "Okay." He went to the lounge inside to rest. Secretary Lee had married and had children these years, so she loved people, children, and even old people like Night Chief. After Yi Mulin lay down, Secretary Lee gently measured his body temperature. His movements were very gentle, so he would definitely not feel uncomfortable. Then, he took a small thermos bag, filled it with hot water, and placed it in Yi Mulin's hand to warm his stomach. Yi Mulin put one hand on his forehead and said softly, "Only you can take care of him so well. If it was Xueli, she probably wouldn't do this, or she would be flustered." Secretary Lee bent over and helped him tuck in the quilt, smiling. Although the chief is disgusted with her, he can't stop smiling when he mentions her. "I'm not laughing. I just dislike her." He frowned again as he spoke, but soon relaxed again. Secretary Lee knew that he wasn't feeling well, so she said softly, "Then I'll go outside to clean up. If it's still not good in half an hour, I'll go to the hospital. You have to listen to me on this." His illness had dragged on for a few years. He had worked like a madman, and did not take care of himself. Secretary Lee tiptoed out, and closed the door behind her. She quietly tidied up the documents outside. After half an hour of tidying up, she knocked on the door and went in. Yi Mulin did not look well. His face was pale. Secretary Lee went over to touch her forehead and murmured, "I'll get someone to send you to the hospital." Yi Mulin was awake. His entire body was icy cold, but it would heat up in a moment. It was very, very hot. Closing his eyes, he mumbled, "My phone is in my pocket. Call Shirley for me. Tell her to go home first, and tell her that I have to work overtime." After he finished speaking, he frowned again and closed his eyes. Secretary Lee knew that he was very uncomfortable, so she took the phone and asked someone to send him to the hospital first. Chapter 3691. The black limousine silently sent him to the hospital. Sometimes it was a sad position to sit in this position. He didn't dare to let others know that he was sick, for fear that others would say that he was too weak and should retire. Secretary Lee sat in the car, looking calm. She had experienced such things many times in the past few years, and she handled it perfectly every time. She was so skilled that she even had a special passage in the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctor quickly pushed him into the examination room. The result was good. It was just acute inflammation, and he would be fine after 2 days of infusion. But the doctor said seriously, "The general is too careless and always forgets to eat during work. His stomach is not good, and he needs to take care of it. I told him many times, but he didn't listen. I thought he would restrain himself in the past 6 months, but it happened again. Shaoli, you have to persuade him. It's not good if it goes on like this." The doctor said something serious again. "Nocturnal Chieftain is less than 40 years old. How can you be a secretary?" Secretary Lee felt sorry for him and felt wronged. After a while she said, "I will think of a way." Regarding this, he could probably only start from Bai Xueli. The bureau chief would probably listen to her. Thinking of this, she remembered that she hadn't made a call, so she dialed it. Soon Bai Xueli picked up. "Yi Mulin, you said you would be back at the hotel at 8, but it's almost 9. I'm leaving now." Secretary Lee said, "Xueli, it's me." Bai Xueli was stunned. "Secretary Lee? No, why is his phone in your hands?" Secretary Lee smiled bitterly. "The general's stomach is acting up again. He asked me to call you, but he didn't let me tell you. But I thought about it and decided to tell you. He is now on N4 drip in the hospital." Bai Xueli was stunned for a while, then said blankly, "Where is he? Is it serious?" "It's all right. Did I scare you?" Secretary Lee hurriedly comforted him softly. What a joke, this was the bureau chief's precious baby. Bai Shueli was silent for a while. Secretary Li probed carefully. Aren't you coming over? Bai Shueli bit her lip. He will think I am clumsy. Secretary Li was about to burst out laughing, but he tried his best to hold it in. No, the bureau chief was praising you just now. This probably gave Bai Shueli some confidence. She immediately got ready and asked the taxi driver to drive the car to the hospital. She also called her parents and told them that she would be out for a few more days. Mr. and Mrs. Bai were naturally willing. When Bai Shueli arrived at the hospital, Yi Mulan was already connected to an intravenous drip. He was lying quietly, but he was still worried about Bai Shueli. He asked Secretary Li, "Have you called?" While peeling an apple, Secretary Li said softly, "I did," but Shirley insisted on asking. "I accidentally said it out loud. Director, I'm sorry." "You'll forgive me, right?" Yi Mulan glared at her. After a long time he scolded softly, "You're getting more and more daring." Secretary Li put the apple away. He looked at it. "I can't eat. Why are you peeling this thing?" "It's for Shirley. She's probably hungry." Secretary Li smiled mischievously. At this moment the door opened. Yi Mulan thought it was Bai Shueli, so he said naturally, "Didn't I ask you to wait for me in the hotel?" However, it was Wen Yuan who came in. Because they were in the same hospital, he saw Secretary Li and came over. Chapter 3692. The atmosphere was a little strange. Wen Yuan smiled at Secretary Li and walked over. "Why are you not feeling well again? How is it?" Secretary Li answered on his behalf. "I'm too indulgent and something went wrong." She then glanced at Yi Chief's neck. Wen Yuan saw it too and coughed. "I really don't know what to say." Yi Mulan felt better after the 4 drip. He smiled faintly. "Wen Yuan, you're laughing at me." Wen Yuan sat by the bed. "How would I dare to laugh at you? I just feel that you don't know how to take care of yourself." She sighed. "Mulan, you always take good care of everyone but yourself. I heard from the doctor that your stomach will be in trouble if it continues like this." "It's not that serious." Yi Mulan smiled faintly and said casually, "Oh right, how is Xiangnan?" Wen Yuan smiled. "He's doing well, and will be discharged soon. But he came in again." Yi Mulan thought about it and whispered, "Mubai didn't come again." Wen Yuan shook his head, and didn't seem to want to continue the conversation. Yi Mulan looked at her for a long time and sighed. He didn't ask anymore. His identity was subtle, and it wasn't good to ask too much. At that moment, the door to the ward opened. It was Bai Shueli. The moment she opened the door, she saw Wen Yuan sitting in front of the bed. She was stunned for a moment, and instinctively wanted to leave. Yi Mulan and Wen Yuan saw her and Secretary Li. Secretary Li covered her eyes. God, how could she forget about this? Bai Shueli looked at her quietly and whispered, "I'm sorry, I'll leave now." She looked up at Yi Mulan and said softly, "Also get well soon." Bai Shueli thought of herself as a thick-skinned person, but she still felt hurt after seeing such a scene. Also, it was embarrassing. After all, she was facing Wen Yuan, Yi Mulan's wife in name. Wherever Wen Yuan was, she couldn't be seen. She suddenly wanted to cry. Her eyes were red, but she didn't want to show weakness. She bit her lips and ran out. Yi Mulan wanted to pull out the 4 drip and chase after her, but Wen Yuan stopped him. "I'll go after her." He looked at her. Wen Yuan smiled. "How long are you going to lie to her? Don't bully her." "I'll go after them. Don't worry." Secretary Li was still in a daze. Wen Yuan had already stood up and walked out, quickly chasing after the departing Bai Shueli. Fortunately, Bai Shueli was no longer the willful little girl from back then. Otherwise, she would have run away very quickly. Wen Yuan caught up with Bai Shueli and said softly, "Shueli, can we talk?" Bai Shueli's eyes were red. She was a grown woman. She walked forward with all her might. She said somewhat angrily, "I don't want to talk about it. I wish you both a long life." Wen Yuan was annoyed and amused at the same time. She finally knew what it felt like to be angered half to death by Yi Mulan. Bai Shueli was really interesting. Still, she caught up with her and walked abreast of her. She admitted that she had done it on purpose. Sure enough, Bai Shueli got in the way after a while. She stopped and glared at Wen Yuan. I've already wished you happiness. What else do you want? He wants you to swear that you'll never leave him. Wen Yuan said, trying not to laugh. Bai Shueli didn't hear it clearly and immediately replied. Wen Yuan, you're too much. Why should I swear that I'll never leave him? She then looked at Wen Yuan with widened eyes. What do you mean by that? She wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Hubby, addicted to pampering. On WeChat she followed you to literature. Talking about life, and looking for a bosom friend. Chapter 3693. It's very simple. Yi Milan and I have divorced after hearing the news of your return. Shueli, this marriage certificate between him and me is also for outsiders to see. Xiangnan only calls him uncle at home. Yi Milan and I are like family. Because Xiangnan has the blood of the Yi family, he let me live in the Yi family. That's all. And Shueli, Yi Milan always says that you're stupid. But I don't think you're that stupid. You can always tell whether a man loves you or not, and how much he loves you. Bai Shueli almost exploded. What do you mean I don't think you're that stupid? Her eyes became rounder. Wen Yuan suddenly smiled. Actually, Shueli, I like you very much. You're quite cute, just like that little white on Mulan's desk. I heard from him that this little bastard looks a lot like you, right? He treasures it very much. Xiangnan asked for it several times, but he refused to give it to him. Bai Shueli gritted her teeth and said slowly, Wen Yuan, are you a devil? Wen Yuan smiled. I just like you, so go and see him. I just happened to come over. Don't you think it's too much to accuse me and him like this? Look, I'm not the one who made him sick. Bai Shueli felt that Wen Yuan's eloquence was poisonous. But Wen Yuan still smiled. I have to accompany Xiangnan. But Xiangnan may want to see his uncle later. If you have anything inappropriate for children, hurry up. Otherwise, it won't be good if other children see it. Bai Shueli was very guarded against Wen Yuan, but when she heard Xiangnan's name, she felt sorry for him. She bit her lips and hesitated for a moment. Then she said, Are you going to be with Little White? Wen Yuan smiled faintly and then said in a low voice, Shueli, I actually admire you. We've been rivals in love for many years. You liked Mubai back then, and you chased after him vigorously. But I didn't have the courage, and I made a mess of things. Bai Shueli cheered him up. But you gave birth to a son for him. His brother kidnapped me and sent me to the church. However, Wen Yuan had married Yi Milan before, although it was only in name. Bai Shueli said unhappily, Actually, Little Bai is quite poisonous. Everyone loves you when they see you, and flowers bloom when they see you. Wen Yuan laughed, but there was a hint of loneliness in his laughter. He has a girlfriend, and he has forgotten about me, she paused. Even if he remembers, he probably doesn't like me. She was the one who forced it. Seeing her like this, Bai Shueli no longer felt jealous. She went over and hugged Wen Yuan's arm. Don't be discouraged. Also give Xiaobai some time. I think he will remember and come back. Wen Yuan, you still have a son. You have to pull yourself together for the sake of Xiangnan. Wen Yuan nodded and gently stroked Bai Shueli's hair. Now I know why Yi Milan misses you so much. It's because you're a little fool. Bai Shueli jumped up. Wen Yuan, you're poisonous. Then she snorted. Actually, I'm still your sister-in-law. Wen Yuan smiled. All right, sister-in-law. Let's go and see our night chief. Otherwise, he will really have to pull out the 4. He's so stupid. Bai Shueli gritted her teeth. Wen Yuan sighed. He's just confused because he cares too much. Bai Shueli, you should give him a happy life. After he's done so much for you. I want to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Hubby, addicted to pampering. WeChat follow you to literature, chat about life, and find bosom friends. Chapter 3694. For a moment, Bai Shueli's emotions were a little complicated. After a while, she looked at Wen Yuan. I'll help you, but I'll go check on Yi Milan first. Bring Xiangnan over later. Wen Yuan smiled. All right. The two women separated. When Bai Shueli walked into Yi Milan's ward, her face was a little embarrassed. She stood at the door for a long time before pushing it open. Yi Milan was lying down. When he saw her, he glanced at her and said softly, Finally willing to come back? She did not say anything and walked over slowly. Standing in front of him, she asked softly, "Are you feeling better?" He lay down and looked at her. No. There was even a hint of coquettishness in Yi Mulan's tone. It gave Bai Shuili goosebumps as she looked at him helplessly. After a long time she said, "You're already so old and you don't even know how to take care of yourself." He squinted at her. "I took care of your Yuang. Bai Shuili, do you still have a conscience?" She then snorted softly. "How are you taking care of me? You're clearly taking care of yourself." She then glanced at him. "You were the one who was starving for a few years. Don't push everything to me." "Then who should I look for?" He looked at her, not letting go of any changes in her. She stammered for a long time before saying, It has nothing to do with me." He stared at her. "Bai Shuili, tell me if it has anything to do with you." "Oh," she replied before sitting down on the bed. Her fair and slender hand grabbed his hand and looked at him. "Who asked you to keep your chastity as a jade?" He laughed, looking as though he did not want to bother with her idiotic look. Bai Shuili stuck her head over. "Didn't I come to see you? Why do you look so angry? I didn't even argue with you when you threw me out of the hotel." He rolled his eyes at her again. She played with his hand and lowered her head slightly. After a while she said softly, "Oh right, you didn't tell me about your divorce either. You even lied to me that you were a mistress. I didn't even get mad at you even though I was so angry." Yi Mulan looked up and looked at her warmly. His gaze was rather strange. Bai Shuili's eyes were sparkling. She kept playing with his palm, and her expression was a little warm. Yi Mulan's heart had already softened, but he pretended to be angry on the surface. He looked at her and said, "Bai Shuili, are you begging me to marry you now?" She lowered her head and looked at him. "Then if I beg you, will you marry me or not?" "It depends on my mood." Nocturnal Chieftain looked a little arrogant. She was furious and ignored him. At this time, Secretary Li just came back with plain porridge. Seeing their expressions, he was amused. He put the porridge on the bedside table and said softly, "Chief, how about I go home first? Shirley can stay here and take care of her." Yi Mulan had no objections. Bai Shuili bit her lip. "Can he eat by himself?" Secretary Li said seriously. "Previously, the bureau chief couldn't even stand properly. It's better to feed him. Why don't I stay and feed him?" Bai Shuili was a little drunk just thinking about that scene. She smiled dryly and said, "Let me do it." Secretary Li held back his laughter and nodded. "Pay attention to how hot it is. Remember to let it cool before feeding it." Bai Shuili cursed in her heart, but she still nodded politely and sent Secretary Li away. After Secretary Li left, she sat on the bedside and picked up the bowl of porridge. She scooped a spoonful of porridge and sent it to Yi Mulan's mouth. She wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Husband, addicted to pampering. She followed Yuta literature on WeChat, talking about life and looking for bosom friends. Chapter 3695. Yi Mulan didn't eat but said lightly. Secretary Li left. "So you changed to another person? Bai Shuili, are you forcing yourself? Then give me a standard, Chieftain Yi, and I will smile according to your request," she said with a fake smile. Yi Mulan looked at her and snorted. "When did your mouth become so sharp? They say that you are stained by the company you keep. It seems like this saying is not wrong at all. It has only been a few days, and your mouth has become so sharp." Bai Shuili bit her lips. "It is obvious that you will be stained by the company you keep." He smiled. "That's fine too." As he spoke, he pulled her onto the bed. Bai Shuili said softly, "The porridge is going to spill. You are still so crazy when you are sick." He smiled and kissed her lips, and then let her go. "This is to punish you for being disobedient." Then he let her go, took the porridge and ate half of it, leaving the other half for her. "I don't want to eat this," she said with some dislike. "I can go out for a feast later." Yi Mulan stared at her with a dark face. "Bai Shuili saved it for you, and you dare to go out for a feast?" He pinched the tip of her nose. "Do you still have a conscience?" She cried out in pain from his pinching. After he let go of her, she rubbed and complained. "I don't like to eat this. Don't save it for me. You can finish it yourself and I'll feed you, okay?" He still looked unhappy, and his expression was very arrogant. Bai Shueli pursed her lips and smiled, and went to feed him. He stared at her, looking as though he was unwilling to take another bite. Bai Shueli looked at him. That's more like it. You don't know how to take care of yourself, and let others worry about you, she said lightly, but he still caught a touch of heartache in her eyes. He looked at her and asked softly, Shueli, actually you want me to eat more. So you say that you don't want to eat it, right? It's mainly because I don't like it. She stuck out her tongue. Yi Mulan's expression became gentle, and he stroked her hair. Sha Dan, you care about me, don't you? No. She denied it and couldn't help saying, Yi Mulan, I will watch you eat in the future. In his eyes, there was a trace of a smile and a trace of gentleness. I'll have someone send food over in a while. I'm just afraid that you won't be able to stand the smell. She looked inside. I'll just eat noodles here. She often cooked for herself now, and the food she made was still edible. Yi Mulan lay flat and reached out to hold her hand. He didn't say anything. They all understood. Bai Shueli wanted to go downstairs, but she couldn't bear to. She sat on the bed and leaned her forehead against it. He opened his eyes. Shueli? Her voice was a little hoarse. Yi Mulan, we won't be separated again, right? He smiled faintly and put one hand behind his head. Then he said in a low voice, Surely, if you must confess to me, wait until my body is better, You can propose any time. Of course it's you proposing to me. Bai Shueli wrinkled her nose. He closed his eyes and rested. All right. She still leaned against him and refused to leave. Yi Mulan gently rubbed the back of her neck and sighed. Shueli, after so many years, why are you still like a child? She leaned against him and said, Then I'll call you Dad in the future. His face darkened and he scolded, Nonsense. Our Yi Mulan is really a traditional man. There are 2 more chapters, updated before 10 p.m. Want to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Husband, addicted to pampering. WeChat follow you to literature talk about life, find a bosom friend. Chapter 3696. She hugged his waist like a rascal and rubbed her face on his shoulder. I'll call you Dad. He had no choice but to compromise. Don't let Anan hear it, or it will look bad. She whispered in his ear. Don't worry. I'll call you that when there are only the 2 of us. His heart softened. In fact, his rice worm hadn't changed at all. She was still dependent and clingy, but she was forced to be independent. Just the thought of her living abroad with Anan, working and taking care of a child alone made his heart ache. He even forgot that he was sick. Outside the ward, Yang Nan listened at the door, then looked up and whispered to Wen Yuan. Auntie Bai is so old. Why is she still calling Uncle Dad? Anan should call Uncle Dad. Wen Yuan's expression was very interesting. She didn't even know how to answer Xiangnan's words. She couldn't say to Xiangnan, This is your uncle and Auntie Bai's marriage. She was too embarrassed to say it. Besides, if Xiangnan continued to ask, she would also have a headache, so she just said vaguely, Your uncle and Auntie Bai are thinking about how to educate Anan. Your Auntie Bai is playing Anan. Oh Mom, I know it's a role-playing game. An idea came to Xiangnan, and he looked at his mother eagerly, wanting to be praised. Wen Yuan was cursing in her heart, but she showed a motherly smile on her face. Something like that. She really couldn't bear to tell her son what a role-playing game was, she sighed. Let's go back to the ward first. Your uncle is a little busy. Xiangnan nodded and whispered, Mom, I want to play role-playing games too. Wen Yuan couldn't help but sigh, and then she said to her son, What do you think about catching a puppy tomorrow? Xiangnan's little face looked down, and he said after a while, There is a pretty girl next door. I want her to call me Dad. Wen Yuan. She now felt that she should stay away from Yi Mulan and Bai Shueli. They were poisonous together. In the ward, it was as warm as before. Bai Shueli stayed in Yi Mulan's arms for a long time and refused to move away. She smelled the medicine and felt that it was his manly scent. After a long time, Yi Mulan pinched her little face. Shueli, aren't you hungry? I'm not hungry. Her voice was soft. I just want to feel your warmth. He paused for a long time before saying, Actually, I wanted to go to the bathroom. Bai Shueli looked up. Are you a devil? She snorted. I'll help you get the drip. Yi Mulin was a very proud man. Although he wanted her full service, he gave up after thinking about the scene. He still hoped that he could maintain a high and mighty image in her heart, so he reservedly refused. Bai Shueli didn't force her. Then I'll go down. He smiled and took the infusion bottle to the washroom. As he peed, he thought that maybe it was because she came over. His stomach problem seemed to have recovered a little faster, and it didn't hurt anymore. When he was done, he went out and smelled the fragrant aroma coming from the small kitchen. At this time, he also felt that one bowl of porridge was not enough, so he went into the small kitchen. She was at the bottom, and she was very focused. Her eyes were lowered, and she looked especially soft. His heart couldn't help but soften. With one hand holding the infusion bottle, he put the other hand on her waist and held her gently. He rested his chin on her shoulder and murmured, "Make more. I'm a little hungry." This book came from Chapter 3697. Bai Shueli turned her head to look at him and smiled. I'll cook it for you first. Sit at the small dining table. Oh, I'll get the shelf for you first. She then turned down the fire and ran over to get it. She came back and helped him adjust it before going downstairs again. Yi Mulin rubbed his chin and said thoughtfully, Bai Shueli, you're not yourself today. Could you be a fake? You're the fake one. She glared at him and helped him fill up a bowl of noodles. He looked at it and thought it was beautiful. It was just a few green vegetables and an egg, but it was surprisingly fragrant. He felt a sense of bliss in his heart, but he took a bite without batting an eyelid. It tasted good, light and delicious. Bai Shueli stood at the side. Is it good? He smiled at her. Seems like Secretary Li has entrusted it to the right person. Bai Shueli blushed slightly and turned her head away to eat the noodles. It was almost 11 p.m., and she was indeed hungry. She didn't eat the noodles very elegantly. Yi Mulin looked up at the way she was eating the noodles. He thought to himself that it felt good and warm for the two of them to eat noodles quietly like this. This was the life he yearned for. Even though the price he had to pay was a little high. Actually, it wasn't that there was no one who could replace her and eat noodles in front of him. But he just didn't want to, because if it wasn't for her, he wouldn't want it. Yi Mulin smiled and suddenly said, I'll take care of my body in the future. Bai Shueli was a little stunned and looked up at him. I said I'll take care of myself, you and Anon. Yi Mulin lowered his head and said coldly. Then he said casually, Oh yeah, if you're free, let's go get our marriage certificate. Our child isn't young anymore. Bai Shueli looked at him. Yi Mulin, are you proposing? I'm asking for your opinion. He smiled and habitually put on a superior attitude. Bai Shueli glared at him. No champagne, no roses, no big diamond ring? She shouted. Let me tell you, I'm as pompous as ever. He smiled. I think it's better for us to communicate about this kind of thing first. I want to get a definite answer. Otherwise, if the scene is so big and you don't agree, it'll be hard for me to step down. She looked at him with poisonous eyes. I still have to worry about my identity, surely, He coaxed her. Don't you think so? She felt that something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. So she hesitated for a moment. All right then. He grunted and then said very slowly. Oh right, I forgot to tell you, there are financial restrictions on public officials. They refuse to be extravagant and wasteful. She was dumbfounded for a long time before she came to her senses. Yi Mulin, do you mean that there are no flowers or big diamond rings? He looked at her with some regret and said pragmatically, I'll just buy a ring. As for the wedding, we should keep it simple. It's really not good to make a big scene. At this moment, she finally understood that he had spent so much time just to trick her. He's so bad, she said angrily. Then I won't get married. He didn't mind and said proudly, Bai Shueli, think carefully. It's rare for me to be single. After this period, I might not be single anymore. He's so shameless, she thought to herself. Chapter 3698. Yi Mulin, we will never be separated again. Bai Shueli was so angry that she stared at him and said, Then don't get married. He reached out and touched her face. Aren't you afraid that I will be taken away by another woman? I'm not afraid. She looked at him. I can also find a stepfather for an inn. My market is no worse than yours, Yi Milan. Yi Milan knocked her little head. By Shueli, don't even think about it. He paused for a moment before saying, Who else can you find besides me? Do you think other men can satisfy you like me? Why not? Look at you, you're always sick, and you still have the nerve to say that you're strong. She despised him. Yi Milan couldn't stand it anymore. He reached out and dragged her body over. His eyes were burning. I can still make you die now. Then he kissed her. She thought it would be a storm, but he kissed her gently. After the kiss, he said softly, Have you changed your mind now? She sat on his lap, reached out and touched his beautiful lips. She blushed and asked, Yi Milan, do you always rely on your mouth? His gaze became a little hot, and he gently bit her finger. Let's try it later, She leaned against his face and smiled softly. Mr. Yi, you'd better take care of yourself. Don't think about it, huh? I thought it was you who thought about it. He bit her again, then shamelessly licked her finger. It was a very suggestive gesture. Bai Shueli bit her lip, and instinctively wanted to withdraw her hand. He didn't stop her, but smiled warmly. She withdrew her hand, but still felt that it was wet and hot, as if there was his saliva there. She secretly wiped it with her other hand, thinking that he was really shameless. Yi Milan smiled and rubbed his stomach. Well, help me to lie down on the bed. Only then did she find that his face was actually a little pale. She muttered with heartache and dissatisfaction. You're not feeling well, but you're still making trouble like this. Although she blamed him, she still carefully helped him to lie down in the ward and covered him with the quilt. She asked worriedly, Do you want to call a doctor over to take a look? He held her hand and said softly, It's okay. I probably ate a little too much. It's just a little uncomfortable. It's not a big deal. She replied with an oh, and obediently sat beside him, looking like she was at his beck and call. Yi Milan closed his eyes for a while, then looked up at her and smiled gently. Surely, don't you think we are like an old married couple? Bai Shueli leaned on his arm and rolled her eyes at him. Then she snorted. We don't have a marriage certificate now. How are we an old couple? We're more like old dogs. He was amused and annoyed at the same time. He reached out and knocked her head. Bai Shueli, I'm single now. Where did she come from? Where did she learn all these words? Bai Shueli was still leaning on him softly. She said in a low voice, I don't care. We're not legally married anyway. Yi Milan reached out and touched her head. He sighed softly. I didn't expect you to be in such a hurry. She suddenly blushed. I'm not in a hurry. My market is very good. If you don't marry someone else, you can marry someone else. But, Bai Shueli, you only want to marry me, don't you? He sighed softly. She wanted to deny it, but under his gaze, she felt that she didn't want to deny it. They were finally together again after much difficulty. End of this chapter. Chapter 3699 Yi Milan will never be apart again. In the end, she just grunted in agreement, looking a little unwilling. He just smiled and didn't make things difficult for her. Moreover, he was indeed a little tired. He lay down and closed his eyes, but his hands were not willing to let go of her. Bai Shueli had been sitting for a long time, and her waist was sore. She also wanted to lie down, but when she saw his tired face, and then looked down at his hand holding hers, her heart couldn't bear it. So she just lay on the side of the bed and let him hold her hand. She was lying on her stomach, and then she could not help but press against his palm. They had been reunited for so long. They had lived together for a few days, and they had even rolled in the sheets. But only at times like this did she dare to tell herself to him, Yi Milan, I missed you so much. Her little face rubbed against his palm, feeling his warmth. It was only at this moment that she admitted how important it was for her that he was single. It gave her the courage to be with him, and that she actually missed him a lot. She missed his temperature, the smell of his body, the heat when he held her, everything about him. Bai Shueli rubbed her face against his palm like a kitten. Then, she was a little dissatisfied and rubbed against his arm. Then, she carefully placed her little head on his shoulder. Even so, she was still not satisfied, and wanted to bury herself in his arms. Just when she was like that, a big hand held her little head, and a low voice with a touch of amusement said, "By Shueli, are you dissatisfied with Yuchio?" She paused for a moment, then realized that he was awake. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. Yi Mulan sighed faintly. "I may not be able to satisfy you since I am sick. But you didn't say that I only know how to talk, right? I can try." She opened her eyes wide and said very slowly, "I wasn't thinking of that sort of thing." "Then why are you rubbing against me? Aren't you secretly asking me to have sex with you?" His voice was filled with laughter. "So you're like this, by Shueli." She really felt that she was suffering in silence. She was clearly just expressing her feelings. Why would he think that way? After thinking carefully for a while, she glared at him and snorted, "It's obviously because you're too sensual." Yi Mulan just smiled and reached out to pull her into his arms, letting her lie down against him. His embrace was very warm. Lying on his shoulder, she actually felt a little restrained, especially when she smelled the pure masculine scent on his body. Her heartbeat quickened. She hugged his waist with her small hands and carefully stuck to him. After a while she said, "Why aren't you saying anything?" He looked down at her. "I want to hear you say it, Shirley." She let out a no sound. Then he frowned. "But I don't seem to have anything to say." Yi Mulan pressed against her forehead and gritted his teeth. "By Shueli." She whimpered and fell into his arms again. He helplessly pulled her hair. "Look at you. You're not young anymore. Why are you still acting like a child?" "Papa," she cried shamelessly. He was really angry and amused at the same time. He was angry that she didn't grow up, but his heart softened. She finally came back. Not only by Shueli, but the millet bug also came back. He pulled her hair and smiled very gently. He leaned over and kissed her, then said very slowly, "Shirley, I missed you very much." Chapter 3700. Yi Mulan. We'll never be apart again. She widened her eyes and looked at him with tears in her eyes. After that, she lay in his arms and cried. She cried very disappointingly. It was only when he said that he was single that she had the courage to cry in front of him. It was only then that she realized how much she minded his identity as a married man. Not only did she mind, but she was also jealous. Even if he and Wen Yuan were only married in name, they lived together. They were husband and wife outside and they breathed the same air. She admitted that she was petty, but she couldn't help but mind and be jealous of Wen Yuan. Now, she didn't need to be jealous of anyone else, because he was hers again. She pinched the flesh on his chest and bit her lip. "Look at you. You're already a third wheel." Yi Mulan grabbed her hand. "Third wheel? Isn't that so? If we get married again, it'll be the third time." She broke free from his hand and started poking at his chest again. "That's third wheel." His eyes were burning as he said slowly, "Based on what you said, aren't you a second wheel?" She looked at him with her eyes wide open. "I'm not, I've never changed." He hugged her tightly in his arms and said slowly, "But I've only slept with one woman, and no one else has touched me. How am I a third wheel? I'm not like a certain someone who's had countless boyfriends since young, and even chased after Mubai for so many years. I haven't despised you, but by Shueli you're despising me?" He put on a superior expression again, and she couldn't find any words to refute him. After a long time, she stuttered and pretended to be righteous. "But you're the only one I've slept with." With that he chuckled lowly and hooked her little face. "Then tell me, are you satisfied?" "Without comparison, I don't know," she said fearlessly. "Then I'll try with another person, and tell you the result." His face darkened. "By Shueli, don't even think about it." He paused for a moment and sighed softly. He reached out to stroke her hair and whispered, "Don't say such things in the future. Shueli, I don't like it." She wanted to say a few more words, but when she saw his expression, she didn't say a word. She obediently lay in his arms and drew circles with her little hand. "Then I won't say it in the future, and I won't make you angry, okay?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with tenderness, but his voice carried a hint of laughter. "Shueli, if you keep messing around like this, I really won't be able to bear it." She looked up at him. "I didn't do anything." He pressed the small of her back and pressed her against him, letting her feel the fruits of her labor. She bit her lip and stuttered a little. No, Yi Mulin, I didn't mean it that way. It's your willpower that's not strong enough. You're too lustful. He really wasn't human. They had clearly done it for so long yesterday. He was already sick, yet he could still do this. She wanted to move away, but he didn't let her. He stared at her deeply and said in an infuriating manner, Do you want to try my mouth? She immediately covered her face and screamed, Yi Mulin, you're too shameless. I want to sleep. Then, her little body hid in his arms, and her little hands wrapped around his waist. She buried her face and said in a voice that sounded like a baby, Yi Mulin, don't move. If you move, I'll pinch you. I'll hurt you. Tomorrow 5 p.m. End of this chapter. Chapter 3701. Other than happiness, there was still happiness. He chuckled lowly, and lowered his head to whisper into her ear. I'm in so much pain right now and I can't move. Why don't you rub it for me? No. She rejected him without thinking and hugged his waist, whispering, You're still so naughty when you're sick. Yi Mulin, you're such a lustful man. He laughed. Actually, he was really tired and wanted to sleep. But with her in his arms, their relationship had reached a new level. It was so peaceful that he couldn't bear to sleep. He kissed her. Kissing her was good too. Even though he was a senior official, he was still a normal man. His stomach disease had mostly recovered. It was late at night, and they were on the same bed, so his mood was inevitably different. He wanted to do it, but a man like Yi Mulin who was introverted on the outside wouldn't directly ask to do it. He just hugged her and kissed her until she couldn't take it anymore. Even when her face was red, he still didn't satisfy her directly, and kept teasing her until she cried. Her eyelids were pink from crying, and her nose was red. Tears hung on her eyelashes, making her look pitiful. Her hands hugged his waist and rubbed against him. That despicable man pretended not to know. Go to sleep. With that said, he actually laid down as though he was going to sleep. Bai Shueli was stunned. She sat there with her head down. He was going to sleep after teasing her like that. What was she going to do? She looked at him helplessly. After a while, she laid down as well and rested her chin on his shoulder, looking at him adorably with her big eyes. He still pretended to sleep. Bai Shueli gritted her teeth angrily and bit his shoulder. Hey! Yi Mulin opened one eye. What's wrong? She bit her lips and said after a while, Didn't you say? She was not that thick-skinned. After a long while she finally said, Didn't you say that you have some special skills? Special skills? He thought for a while, and pretended not to understand. His worm was so angry that she didn't ask anymore. She turned around and said angrily, I'm going to sleep. Yi Mulin looked at her back. Sigh, she really looked like a child. Every strand of her hair was filled with dejection. He chuckled and hugged her from behind, one hand moving downwards. She let out a shrill scream, and he kissed her neck. Surely, is this a special skill? Her breathing was suppressed and restrained, and she could not speak for a long time. Yi Mulin chuckled and pulled her into his arms. He hugged her just like that, letting her tremble in his arms. After a long time, she suddenly turned around and hugged him with her two slender arms. She hugged him very tightly, and there was a slight tremble in her voice. She said no. You don't like it? Yi Mulin's voice carried a faint smile and a hint of gentleness. She shook her head in his arms and hugged him again. She whispered, I'm scared. His heart immediately softened. His little girl was already in her early 30s, but she was still young and inexperienced in this kind of thing. She would still feel shy. We'll come again in 2 days, He whispered in her ear. Although he wanted to, he still restrained himself. He was not young anymore, and he had to take care of his wife and child. She nodded and obediently fell asleep in his arms. He hugged her as if he was hugging her everything. He lowered his head and kissed her. His voice was extremely hoarse. Bai Shueli will never be separated again. End of the chapter. Chapter 3702. The next morning, when the doctor came over, he saw Chieftain Yi leaning against the bed and reading documents, and in his arms lay a woman. While reading the documents, Chieftain Yi reached out and gently rubbed the woman's hair. His expression was especially gentle. The doctors and nurses were stunned for a moment. In the past 2 years, they had dealt with Nocturnal Chieftain many times. It was the first time that they had seen him so amiable, and they had never seen him have such a tender side. And this woman was not Mrs. Yi. Also, Chieftain Ye's son and wife were also in the hospital. Was it really okay for Chieftain Yi to put a woman in his ward and treat her like that? The doctors and nurses were cursing in their hearts, but they didn't dare to say anything. They all came in to help the chief check. Yi Mulin looked up and put down the documents in his hands, saying, "Keep your voice down, don't wake her up." The doctors and nurses thought, "How spoiled. Let's see who can compare with this treatment." They didn't dare to show anything on their faces and helped to check gently, but it still woke Bai Shuili up. Imagine being surrounded by a group of people. Unless it was a pig, it would wake up. Bai Shuili just woke up and didn't realize there was someone else. She didn't open her eyes and kissed his mouth like a chick pecking rice. "Yi Mulin, what time is it?" His heart was warm and a little swayed. If there was no one present, he would definitely kiss her. But now there were so many people he couldn't do it. He sighed. "It's 9:30. So late." Bai Shuili stretched and opened her eyes. "When Yuan said he would bring Xiangnan here last night, why didn't he come?" After saying that, she saw 5 or 6 pairs of eyes staring at her, and everyone's expression was very subtle. Bai Shuili opened her eyes and looked at Yi Mulin. A second later, she got under the quilt and said vaguely, "Pretend I don't exist." Yi Mulin was amused and angry at the same time. It was really embarrassing for her. He reached out and pulled her out of the quilt, then gently brushed away the messy hair on her face, and said with a reproachful tone, "Aren't you afraid of being bored?" Bai Shuili bit her lips and stared at him. "Why are you staring at me?" He gently pinched her cheek. "You look silly." Then he looked at the doctor and nurse and said calmly, "You can go out for a while." His tone was matter-of-fact, and there was even a hint of the attitude of a superior. Suddenly, all the doctors and nurses ran away. Bai Shuili looked at them helplessly. "Yi Mulin, why are you like this? Isn't that a little inappropriate? What's wrong with it?" He took her by the waist, pulled her into his arms and kissed her. At first, he only kissed her lightly, but as time went on, she couldn't take it anymore. She reached out and grabbed his shirt, helplessly accepting his kiss. In the end, she really couldn't take it anymore. She turned her face to the side, blushing. "Yi Mulin, this is a ward." His breathing was restrained as he buried his face in her neck and nibbled on it. He said with a smile, "Then why did you beg me last night?" "I didn't." She blushed. "Even if I did, you were the one who seduced me on purpose." Yi Mulin chuckled and kissed her again. Then he started to put on his clothes. "Yes, I was the one who seduced you on purpose. But your body really can't take it." This book comes from Chapter 3703. Bai Shuili was angry and did not want to talk to him. But when she saw him putting on his clothes, she tugged at him. "Why are you up? Aren't you going to stay for 2 days?" He turned his head, buttoned up his shirt and kissed her. "It's an old problem. I don't need to stay in the hospital." He got up and brushed his teeth. Bai Shuili followed behind him in her pajamas angrily. When he brushed his teeth, she chanted, "Yi Mulin, you're not right." Her childish words made him laugh. He turned his head. "What's wrong with me?" He brushed his teeth, washed his face and shaved. It was very sexy for a mature man to shave. He looked into the mirror, and she looked at him. "Do you still want your body?" He smiled as he shaved. "I'll be fine if I'm careful." She was extremely angry and felt that he was not good. But she could not win against him, so she could only be angry silently. She leaned against the wall and stared at him with an unfriendly gaze. But he felt that she was very cute. After shaving, he cleaned up and walked towards her. Her instincts told her that she should escape, but he had already come over. He pressed his hand on her shoulder and did not let her move. He touched her lips and said in a low voice, "Shuili, are you worried about me?" "No way." She bit her lips and turned her face away. She was obviously angry. He did not care for himself at all. He did not know that she would feel guilty and hurt because of him. She was angry and her eyes turned red. She turned her face away and ignored him. That was so cute, and he liked it so much. Yi Mulan's voice was very low. Xueli, what do I do to make you happier? She did not speak and just lowered her head. After a while, she looked up at him. He stared at her eyes. I have a meeting in the afternoon. Then you have to finish the drip in the morning. It can't be missing. She bargained with him. Yi Mulan's eyes were burning. What about the reward? Bai Xueli bit her lips. Then, she gently leaned over and bit his lips. He reached out and touched his lips. Then he smiled. This is the reward. Bai Xueli, isn't this too childish? Then what do you want? She placed her hand flat on his chest and whispered. His eyes darkened a little, so deep that she didn't dare to look at him directly. He lowered his head and whispered a few words in her ear. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears, and then she nodded. Deal. Nocturnal Chieftain chuckled and rubbed her hair. Then I'll wait for your performance tonight. He walked out and deliberately turned back. Bai Xueli, brush your toothbrush tonight. She immediately exploded. Yi Mulan, don't go overboard. I don't even think you're dirty, yet you're despising me. He gave her a warm smile and went out to call the doctor. The doctors and nurses had been dealing with Spectral Chief Nocturnal for 2 to 3 years. Spectral Chief Nocturnal had always been the most uncooperative patient. But today, it was really the first time that he actually let them do an intravenous drip. In the past, if he didn't feel too uncomfortable the next day, he would directly leave. Seems like the little beauty is still the most useful. I wonder what method she used. In the bathroom, Bai Xueli was brushing her teeth as she thought to herself, I'm going to eat chili tonight. Chapter 3704. Beyond happiness, there is happiness, for Yi Mulan was on the drip, so she went to make breakfast. It was not convenient for him to feed him. At noon, he had to go to the office after the drip. He thought about it and asked the driver to take her back to the Bai family first. He went to the office himself. Before leaving, he gently touched her red lips with his fingers and said in a low and hoarse voice, Bai Xueli, don't forget what you said. She snorted and blushed again. He smiled and walked inside. Bai Xueli suddenly jumped out of the car and hurriedly called his name, Yi Mulan. He turned his head and looked at her. Bai Xueli walked over and stood with him under the sun. She reached out and gently held his hand. Her voice was a little soft. I'll bring Inan back tonight. Don't go so far to pick us up. If you want to see my parents, we'll go there on the weekend. Yi Mulan looked down at her holding his hand. After looking at it for a while, he smiled and kissed her. His voice was also gentle. Okay, be careful when you drive. She nodded and watched him walk in. When she got back to the car, the driver took her to the Bai family. Mrs. Bai and Mr. Bai saw her ask about Yi Mulan. Bai Xueli sighed. It's been hard these years, but he never tells me. Mr. Bai couldn't say much, but Mrs. Bai sighed. He's really good to you. Take advantage of him. And don't be too willful in the future. A man like him needs a good wife. Bai Xueli looked at her mother and said mischievously, Mom, you didn't have this kind of awareness before. Mrs. Bai sighed. I didn't think of this before. I was too high profile and loved to enjoy. So our family. She held her daughter's hand. Mulan is a good person. He's also very good to us. Don't let him down. Bai Xueli hesitated for a moment and said, Mom, I have something to tell you. Under the eyes of Mr. and Mrs. Bai, she said with some difficulty. Yi Mulan said that he and Wen Yuan divorced. I think he and I will get married soon. Mrs. Bai paused for a moment, then said with relief. That's good. They look like a fake couple to me. There's no affection. Bai Xueli didn't say anything else. After lunch, she took Bai Anan back to her apartment. Yi Mulan had a lot of houses, but he seemed to like her staying here. When she came back, she tidied up the house and bought some fresh flowers to decorate the house. She also added some comfortable household items, especially some soft cushions suitable for children. She used the card Yi Mulan gave her to pay for all these. As she swiped the card, she thought to herself, it felt good to have someone taking care of him. Bai Anan rolled around on the cushion and asked her mother, Are we never going to leave? Are we going to stay here forever? And Daddy will always be my daddy. Bai Xueli held the little fellow in her arms and kissed him hard. You can ask Daddy when he comes back. And then you can ask him when he will marry Mommy. By Ainan's eyes widened. After a while she said with some disdain, Mom, you're so lame. How am I inferior? By Ainan, tell me clearly. By Shuali pinched her little face. Poor By Ainan's face was twisted. She forced out a few words. You want to marry Daddy. But you don't even dare to say it yourself, coward. End of chapter. Chapter 3705. Beyond Happiness. There's Happiness 5 by Shuali scoffed. I'm giving him a chance. Men have to take the initiative. Listen up, By Ainan. Don't chase after me when you grow up. By Ainan didn't understand. She widened her eyes and ran off to play. By Shuali watched her run around the big apartment happily, and sighed in her heart. She had brought her up. Even though it wasn't a tough life, it wasn't a good one either. The condo they lived in America was only dozens of square meters, while this place was 500 square meters, and decorated luxuriously. It was normal for a kid to like this place and her dad. By Shuali spaced out for a while, and then went to check on her, and was reading a book, and playing with blocks in her little devil house. She looked very happy. She watched for a while, and felt a little emotional. She walked back to the study and started working. Time passed quickly. 2 hours had passed unknowingly. He picked up his phone, and saw that it was almost 4 o'clock. She thought of Yi Mulin, and hesitated for a moment before picking up her phone to call him. Yi Mulin's meeting hadn't ended yet when his phone rang. Secretary Lee picked it up and said softly, Sir, it's by Shuali. Yi Mulin looked at the phone, and then signaled for the meeting to stop. He picked up the call. What's wrong? His voice was very gentle. No one present had ever enjoyed such treatment before. It felt like a spring breeze. Everyone present felt that Yi Mulin was different recently. He seemed to be glowing with a different kind of youth. It was obvious that the call was from a woman. Bai Shuali said softly, Are you going home for dinner? His breath lightened. What? He liked it when she said the word home. Bai Shuali didn't know what he was thinking, so she repeated, Yi Mulin, are you going home for dinner? He smiled. I should be right? She then asked, What do you want to eat? I'll prepare dinner later. She tried to speak in a calm tone, but her face was still hot, and she was a little embarrassed. Yi Mulin thought about it and said softly, I'll cook a chicken, steam some rice noodles and stir-fry some dishes. That should be enough. She nodded. He waited for a while, but she still didn't speak, so he smiled. Is there anything else? No more. Then, as if she was afraid that he would hang up, she hurriedly said, What time will you be back? Yi Mulin looked at his watch, and checked the progress of the meeting. I'll be home at 6. Later on, the aides could clearly feel that the progress of the meeting had sped up. The chief seemed eager to return home. However, they thought that it was good that the chief had a woman. They didn't have to be fucked so badly, and could go home earlier to eat every day. Finally, at 5 o'clock, everyone got off work punctually. Everyone's faces were beaming with joy. Yi Mulin drove his own car, and it was a rather high-profile car. It was a black Rolls-Royce. He had not driven it for a few months, and today he drove it home for the first time. When he reached the apartment, he put down his keys and briefcase and smelled the aroma of food. A little person ran out of the room and hugged his leg. Daddy! Yi Mulin reached out to pick up the little guy and kissed him. Anan, do you miss Dad? End of chapter. Chapter 3706. Yes. Anan kissed him on the cheek. Yi Mulin carried her to the sofa and fed her water. Then he took off his coat and threw it aside. He said casually, What did Mom say to you today? Mom said. Anan rolled her eyes. Mom asked me to ask you when you're going to marry her. Yi Mulin was a little surprised. Then he looked in the direction of the kitchen. Then with a faint smile on his face, he reached out and pinched his daughter's little face. He asked softly, Does Anan want to marry Mom and Dad? And Anne's eyes widened. She didn't speak at first. Yi Mulin also found that Anan was like a little girl in front of him. Her expression was very pleasing. He hugged the little girl and kissed her. Tell Dad. And Anne's little hand grabbed his collar and whispered, Then do you think Big Brother Nan can stay in our house with us? Yi Mulan's heart and expression were soft. He looked at his little daughter. Did Mom tell you about Brother Xiangnan? Anan nodded and sat in her father's arms. She said softly. Mom said that Brother Xiangnan is also Dad's child. She asked Anan not to bully him. Also, brother is sick. Mom said that she will visit him tomorrow and take Anan with her. Yi Mulan looked at his little daughter and sighed in his heart. Shueli was still a child, but she taught her daughter very well and taught her to have a good view of life. He kissed Anan again. He just felt that he couldn't get enough of such a soft person. In addition to the fatherly affection for Anan, he also felt that she was the child that Bai Shueli gave birth to for him. Anan had the shadow of Bai Shueli in her, so he would love this child very much. He told her to wear a mask when she went to her brother's place, so Bai Anan was obedient. Yi Mulan accompanied his daughter for a while and got up to go to the kitchen. Bai Shueli was still busy. Hearing the footsteps, she said naturally, "It will be ready in a while. If you are hungry, bring the dishes to the table and eat first." As soon as he finished speaking, he gently hugged her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Mrs. Yi, you are very virtuous." She turned her head. "Mr. Yi, you just realized it." He pinched the soft flesh on her waist and chuckled against her face. "I can't bear for you to work so hard." So, her hand caught his to stop him. Yi Mulan looked at her. "I was thinking whether I should invite an aunt to cook for me, but I want to eat the food cooked by Mrs. Yi. So, I think it's better to save the money. It's expensive to raise a child, and you want a big diamond ring and a luxurious wedding. I think we should save some money, don't you think so?" He kept going back and forth like this. She was furious. "Yi Mulan, you're so bad." He smiled softly and still reached out to pinch her face. "How about I come back to cook and you feed me Anan?" Nocturnal Chieftain said rather shamelessly. "Actually, I quite enjoy the feeling of being a gigolo." Bai Shueli, look at my face. I do have the capital, don't you think so? At least there are many women who want to marry me. Bai Shueli finally understood what he meant. She gritted her teeth. "It must be Bai Anan who betrayed me." He chuckled, still sticking to her face, feeling the fine hair on her face. "Bai Shueli, how can you put your life on a child? If you really want to marry, you can tell me, beg me. Please remember the original domain name of this book. 9 Heavens Shenhuang Mobile Version. Chapter 3707. Bai Shueli stared at him. "It's fine if you don't want to marry me. Are you willing to be my nanny?" His eyes were gentle. He reached out and rubbed her little head. "Cook well," she cried. He had already taken the dishes out of the dining room, and then came back to take them. Although she was angry, when he couldn't see her, she secretly pursed her lips and smiled. She was not a nanny. During the meal, Yi Mulan put some dishes in an aunt's bowl. He found that her preferences were almost the same as Bai Shueli's. He observed for a while, and looked at the child's mother with a blaming look. Bai Shueli pretended not to see it. So Yi Mulan put her least favorite carrot into her bowl. "Eat this. It's quite good." Bai Shueli looked at it as if it was poisonous. She slowly looked up at Yi Mulan. "Are you a devil?" Yi Mulan's voice was gentle. "If Anan says Mom will eat it, she will eat it." Bai Shueli, shouldn't you give your child a good example of not being picky? She was furious because she hated carrots the most. She faked a smile. "Yi Mulan, is there anything you don't like to eat?" "But," he spoke very slowly, "Bai Anan eats everything I don't like. Her bad genes are all from you. So shouldn't you correct her in time?" She stared at the carrot for a long time and said, "Some things can't be changed." She frowned. "Yi Mulan, eating this is like eating poison." He stared at her eyes and suddenly smiled. "Is it difficult?" She always felt that his smile was a little warm and strange. Then she thought of the carrot. She bit her lips angrily and stared at him. He was too shameless. Anan was still here. Yi Mulan smiled and didn't force her to eat the carrot. After the meal, he consciously went to wash the dishes and played with Anan for a while. After the little fellow went to sleep, he went to the study. Bai Shueli was in the study, flipping through the reference book. Yi Mulan walked over and directly picked her up from behind. "Mrs. Yi, it's late." "It's not even 9 o'clock. How is it late?" She knew what he wanted to do, so she begged in a soft voice, Yi Mulan, stop fooling around. I'm still busy. He lowered his head and bit down on her neck. We agreed that I would rush back in one night. In the end, you were just coaxing me? He hugged her from behind, buried his face in her neck, and kissed her passionately. Talk. She had no choice but to bite her lips. I told you it's still early. She struggled to get rid of him, and gently stroked his neckline with her fingers. Can I go back to the room at 11 o'clock on time? Mr. Yi, you go to take a bath first. She looked up, her eyes sparkling. You can look forward to it. Yi Mulan's gaze seemed to be on fire. She couldn't stand such a gaze and lowered her head. He stroked her lips with his fingers and said in a low voice, It sounds tempting, but I may not be able to wait until then. As he spoke, he lowered his head and kissed her lips. As he kissed her, he placed her on the desk. Bai Shuili cried out in shock. Yi Mulan. She circled his neck with her hands. I still have to work. Stay with me once. He lowered his head and licked her lips. His voice was extremely low, and it had a kind of masculine seduction. Chapter 3708. Be good. Accompany me 3. She hung onto his neck, her face blushing. Yi Mulan, this is the study room. He kissed her and chuckled. What's wrong with the study room? Dodging his ferocious kisses, Shi Guang was a little speechless. He was practically in a frenzy right now as he raised his head and muttered, Because it's a disgrace to our culture. Yi Mulan laughed deeply. He kissed and rubbed her. Then he stopped and whispered into her ear. Shuili, relax, okay? She was still lying in his arms, unable to let go. He coaxed her. How can you do this? How can I do it? Be good. She lay on his shoulder and said in a trembling voice, Yi Mulan, go to the room. She bit him on the shoulder and didn't let go. She cried softly. She really couldn't stand being bullied by him. Seeing her crying and begging like this, his heart should have softened, but tonight, he wanted to do it in such a sacred place. Her little face was red from crying, and her whole body was soft, which added a bit of fun to it. He kissed her and coaxed her. Be good. You'll be fine in a while. He was bullying her while coaxing her. She gritted her teeth and let out a long moan. Yi Mulan, she cried and begged him to go to the bedroom. He was unwilling and felt that it was very interesting. She kept crying and he coaxed her at first. Later on, when he saw that she was not really in pain, he pressed her down and enjoyed it to his heart's content. He did it like that. She cried and cried. Eventually her voice changed. She moaned softly, and her slender arms wrapped around him tightly. Yi Mulan kissed her, and whispered against the corner of her mouth. So good. His heart was burning. They were together again. After so many years, she was finally his wife again. Thinking about it, he whipped her even more violently. Everything calmed down. She was still hugging him and panting. Her forehead was full of sweat. Her little hand stroked his chest. Yi Mulan, you're too indulgent. Her tone was unhappy. You've just recovered. She lifted her face, her eyes filled with tears. She looked pitiful and alluring. Yi Mulan heaved a sigh of relief and laughed softly. Weren't you hugging me very tightly just now? He whispered into her ear. You won't let me go, will you? Bai Shuili bit her lip and snuggled into his arms again, her little hands gently hammering his back. He chuckled. Aren't we going back to the bedroom? She wanted to go back to the bedroom, but now she didn't need to. She kicked his shoulder. Yi Mulan, I want to flip through the book. I have to hand in the manuscript tomorrow. Don't you think the things between us are more important? He chuckled as he kicked the bedroom door shut and bullied her inside and out. It was almost midnight when he finished. She was so tired that she fell asleep. Before she fell asleep, she remembered to work. She hugged her pillow and whispered, Yi Mulan, I'll sleep for half an hour. Wake me up later. If you can't wake me up, just pinch me. He lay down beside her and kissed her little face. All right, the alarm is set. I'm not asleep either. I'll wake you up later. His gentle voice was like a lullaby. She fell asleep very quickly. When she fell asleep, there was a light smile on her little face. His heart softened. After looking at her quietly for a while, he got up and walked into the study. Her notebook was still open. The original documents were open as well. The reference books were also there. End of this chapter. Chapter 3709. He sat down and patiently began to translate for her. It was a romance novel written in French, and he felt a headache reading it. However, he still translated very quickly. However, he skipped over the bed scenes that were a little annoying. When Yi Mulin had to translate every word, he had mixed feelings. This was indeed a very boring job for him. But this job fed his rice worm, and by Anan, he could understand her love for this job. So even though she didn't earn much, he still didn't ask her to give up her job. Until now, he had no doubt that she had no such thing as ideals. Shirley regarded this as a job that could support her and Anan. She enjoyed it, and he had no reason to object. He had taken up her time just now, so he had to make up for it. Late at night, Yi Mulin worked until 2 o'clock. He helped her finish the manuscript that she had to submit, and checked it again to make sure that there were no problems before he saved it and turned off the computer. Back in the bedroom, the little white pig hugged the pillow and slept soundly. He stood there and laughed silently. Then, he lightly touched Little White, who was on the cabinet, and went over to lie down. Bai Shueli was still in a daze. She hugged him and rested her face on his shoulder. Has Yi Mulin arrived in half an hour? It's only been 5 minutes. He kissed her forehead. Go to sleep. I'll wake you up later. She let out an "oh" and rubbed her face against his chest. She said vaguely, Yi Mulin, you're so nice. He chuckled. Just now in the study, okay? She was not sober, so she followed his words and said, hubby is amazing. He got hot all of a sudden. He leaned over and whispered in her ear. There's something more powerful. Do you want it? Bai Shueli opened one eye and begged in a low voice, no more. Then, she buried herself in his arms again. It hurts a little. His heart immediately softened. He patted her and softly said, I'll buy some medicine for you tomorrow morning. He thought for a moment and said, I haven't done this in a long time. I didn't control my strength well. Don't say any more. She laid in his arms childishly and said in a low voice, Yi Mulin, you have to treat me very, very well. I won't leave you. He smiled and patted her cheek. Because I can earn money now. My wings have hardened, she whispered again. He couldn't help laughing. She had the nerve to say that she had grown up after earning 20 or 30,000 yuan a month. He was really thick-skinned. However, his heart was warm. She was very cute, but he also felt a little insecure. And this was his fault. He was willing to accommodate her. He would support her in whatever she wanted to do, even if it wasn't for money. His wife's career was his career. Later on, it was proven that Yi Mulin could do everything better than anyone else. He supported his wife and accidentally made a lot of money. At this moment, she was nestled in his arms, very obedient. He kissed her, and they fell asleep together. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Bai Shueli suddenly sat up and scratched her head. Oh no, I overslept. Howling in the morning. He pulled her over and kissed her. She sat on his waist and pressed her hands against his chest. She gritted her teeth. Yi Mulin, you said you would call me. You're so naughty. You only know how to act. He teased her on purpose. Aren't you comfortable too? She blushed, mostly because she was angry at him. She grabbed his watch and looked at it. Then she said to herself, let me see if I can make it. I have an appointment with the chief editor at 10 o'clock. Before she got up, she bit his lips. It's all because of you. Your punishment. You're not allowed to touch me for 10 days. Ask for a ticket. Recommend the urban guru Shirshinshu. Chapter 3710. Yi Mulin chuckled as he watched her get up, put on her clothes, and run to the study room. He lay down for a while, closed his eyes, and recalled what had happened last night. He was a little reluctant to leave. In the end, he got up and went to the changing room to change his clothes. After a while, he heard a scream coming from the study room. He shook his head and chuckled. He buttoned his shirt, fastened his belt, and walked to the study room. In the study room, his little bug was hugging the computer with a surprised look on her face. Seeing him come in, her eyes lit up. Yi Mulin, did you touch my computer? He was standing at the door. He was tall, thin, and good-looking. He didn't look like an old man who had been married for a long time. She glared at him, but her gaze was piercing. Yi Mulin, tell me, was it you? He smiled and walked in. He first looked at the computer, and then looked at her. He reached out and touched her little head. Are you sure it's not Miss Tianluo? She was still looking at him, and snorted softly. Miss Tianluo is not a man. You're sure it's a man just like that? He bent down. Let me see. Bai Shuili pulled down the document for him to see, and then hugged his arm. Mr. Yi, are you sure it's not you who did it? He said. Take your time to read it. I'll make breakfast. Consider it as payment for your hard work last night. It would have been better if he hadn't mentioned it. Now that he mentioned it, she immediately remembered what happened last night. Bai Shuili blushed and stared at him. He smiled and walked out to the kitchen. She began to read his translation, and was fascinated by it. It was really not bad. However, she later found out that he had cut out some of the emotional descriptions, especially some of the romantic words. She complained. What a straight man's point of view. Then she added some more into the room. It looked much better this way. When Yi Mulin came in, she complained to him behind her. Look at you. You've been a leader for too long. You're so boring. Look at this place. It's so dry. There's no meaning at all. Little girls won't like it. He bent down and placed his hands on both sides of her chair. His face was close to hers. Dry. He frowned and then chuckled in her ear. Did you feel dry last night? These words, Bai Shuili's face suddenly turned red. She bit her lip and stared at the computer screen, not daring to look at him. Yi Mulin, you're not allowed to say that. She purposely said fiercely. He held her waist tightly with one hand, not giving her a chance to escape, and said in a low voice with a chuckle, Then what shall we talk about? She bit her lip and glared at him. Anyway, your translation isn't very good. He raised his eyebrows and read the words she translated. They were all words of love, and he said them in a low voice. It seemed like he was reading them, but it was more like he was confessing to her. Her cheeks were steaming, and she thought she could boil an egg. Nocturnal Chieftain finished reading a paragraph and looked at her. So you like this? Stop, this is a romance novel, not a daily life. Yi Mulin, let me tell you, don't use these things to disgust me in the future. She complained seriously, so he chuckled and kissed her cheek. I thought you liked these. He pondered for a moment, then said, Oh yeah, how did you translate those bed scenes? It's too late. You can watch it tomorrow. End of this chapter. Chapter 37:11. An ugly daughter-in-law meeting an ugly daughter-in-law. Bai Shuili glared at him. Yi Mulin, she whispered, you don't look like a leader at all. She looked down and twisted her fingers. She looked at the computer and didn't say anything. He knew that she was embarrassed, or maybe she felt that he had offended her profession. He smiled faintly, and reached out to carry her. He sat down and put her on his lap. He leaned over and asked, Are you angry? I don't dare to be angry at the leader, she said angrily. She lowered her head and didn't want to talk to him. Yi Mulin seemed to be in a good mood. It was probably because he had had enough fun last night. He smiled. You're still saying you're not angry? You can hang an oil bottle on your mouth. She still ignored him. Shuili, we're at home now. What can't we talk about, huh? He leaned against her face. Or what do you think the leader should be like? Tell me. Not someone as shameless as you. She bit her lip and said. He reached out and pinched her chin, forcing her to look at him. After a long time, he said in a husky voice, Shuili, but I'm your husband first, and then I'm a senior official. I've been interacting with you as a man. I'm not a high and mighty leader. If there's anything about me that makes you feel strong, it's because I'm a man and you're a woman. When we bicker, I can act like a hooligan. If it doesn't work, I can use force. That's it, huh? Her eyes were watery. Yi Mulin, where did you learn to be so eloquent? He was really bad. He had a bunch of twisted logic. He chuckled. I used to be a lawyer. Seeing that she was still angry, his voice softened. Look at you, you're still like a child. I stayed up late to translate for you. Not only did you not thank me, but you also gave me a cold shoulder. Now that I think about it, I'm not like a leader. I'm afraid of my wife at home. It's quite a failure. Bai Shuali couldn't stand his policy of mourning for the soldiers. She was tricked again. She cried and leaned against him. Actually, you did a good job. He smiled. Don't you think I'm dry? She blushed. He chuckled again and whispered something in her ear. She could hardly stay in his lap. He was too shameless. Yi Mulan let her go and asked her to prepare the things. Send An to my mother's place later. She also wants to see you. You can pick her up after you see the chief editor. Bai Shuali bit her lip. Should I see him? He raised his eyebrows. What do you think? As he spoke, he twirled her hair and said thoughtfully, an ugly daughter-in-law has to meet her in-laws. You're the ugly one. She snorted, then copied his shameless behavior and whispered in his ear. Yi Mulan, that part of you is ugly. He really didn't expect her to say such a thing. He looked at her in disbelief. Blushing, she copied it on the USB, stuck out her tongue, and ran out. After she left, Yi Mulan lowered his head and looked at himself. After a while he followed her out. He had to find a chance to let her see whether he was ugly or not. And what part of him was ugly? Bai Shuali returned to the bedroom. Her face was red. She learned bad things from him. But when she thought of seeing Sufu, her heart skipped a beat. It was very strange. So in the car, she said that she wouldn't go if he carried in and over. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.